The eviction notice gave Jack Morrison 72 hours to clear out of the apartment he had shared with his 8-year-old son. 72 hours to figure out where they would sleep when landlords required first month last month, and security deposits he did not have, when shelters separated families, when his bank account showed negative $47 from overdraft fees stacking like cordwood. His truck had a quarter tank of gas. His phone would shut off in 5 days when the bill he could not pay came due. The medical debt from his wife's accident 2 years ago in late summer of 2022 sat at $340,000, a number so large it had stopped feeling real, had become just another weight pressing down on shoulders already bent from carrying grief and failure, and the knowledge that he was supposed to be stronger than this. Jack sat in the apartment complex parking lot on this August evening in 2024, with the notice in his hand and his son, Ethan, asleep in the passenger seat, both of them processing the fact that 2 years of barely surviving since Sarah died had finally collapsed into actual homelessness. The paper trembled in his grip, not from fear, though fear lived in his chest like a second heartbeat. The trembling came from rage at a system that could destroy a family for the crime of getting hurt, for Sarah's crime of losing control on black ice and sliding into a semi-truck that crushed the driver's side door into her ribs and spine and skull. The emergency room had saved her for 6 hours, long enough for Jack to get there, long enough to say goodbye. Long enough for the hospital to generate $218,000 in charges that insurance covered only partially, that medical bankruptcy could not fully erase, that garnished his wages when he found work and destroyed any chance of credit when he did not. He had worked construction when he could find it, had done roofing and framing and finished carpentry, any labor that paid cash or took a man with a decade of Army engineering experience and hands that still knew how to build things that would not fall down. But steady work was scarce in Wyoming for men without the right connections or the willingness to work for wages that could not feed a family. The jobs came and went. The debt never left. The eviction notice was just the newest way of saying what Jack already knew. He had failed to protect his family. Failed Sarah when the roads iced over. Failed Ethan every month the rent came due, and the checking account showed red numbers that grew like cancer. Ethan stirred in his sleep, 8 years old and carrying trauma that made him wake up screaming sometimes, reaching for a mother who was not there and never would be again. His face in the streetlight looked younger than 8, looked like the 6-year-old he had been when Sarah died, when the world still made sense and parents did not disappear into coffins, and poverty did not taste like every meal. Jack reached over and adjusted the jacket covering Ethan's shoulders. The boy did not wake. Small mercy in a season of none. The county foreclosure auction list had been a desperate scroll through his phone earlier that evening, looking for anything cheap enough that his last paycheck from the roofing job might cover. Most properties went for thousands. Abandoned houses needing foundations and new roofs and electrical work he could do himself if he had time and money for materials, which he did not. Commercial buildings requiring permits and inspections and capital that belonged to a different life. A different version of Jack Morrison, who had not buried his wife and watched his savings evaporate into medical billing departments and collection agencies. But there, listed at the bottom of the page where hope went to die, was something that caught his attention through sheer impossibility of the price. Anderson Valley Ranch, 420 acres, structures condemned. Minimum bid $850, no utilities, no road access, sold as is for salvage or demolition. Buyer assumes all back taxes and liability. The name hit him first. Anderson Valley. He knew that name. Knew it the way you know the scar tissue from an old wound, something that had shaped you before you were old enough to understand the shaping. His grandfather Frank Morrison had ranched in Anderson Valley back in the 70s, back when Jack was too young to remember anything but photographs and his father's bitter stories about how Frank had lost everything. Bad investments, his father always said. Grandpa Frank made bad choices, and the bank took it all. Died at 61 from a heart attack that everyone knew was really just despair made flesh. Jack had grown up in the shadow of that loss. His father had turned from rancher's son to construction worker, had spent 30 years framing houses for other people, and dying at 52 from the kind of exhaustion that comes from working too hard for too little for too long. The Morrison family legacy was poverty dressed up as bad luck, was the understanding that some people were meant to own land, and some people were meant to dig foundations for those who did. But Anderson Valley, the name pulled at something in Jack's chest that was not quite memory and not quite hope, just recognition that the place where his family's decline had started was for sale for less than a month's rent, for $850. He pulled up the auction photos on his phone, the screen brightness turned down to keep from waking Ethan. The images showed a ranch that should have been condemned decades ago. A main house with the roof caved in, windows gone, walls leaning at angles that defied physics. A barn that looked like a strong wind might finish what time had started, though the basic structure still stood, massive timbers visible through gaps in the weathered siding. 3 outbuildings that were more collapse than building. Land overgrown with sagebrush and scrub, 420 acres of high desert valley ringed by mountains that looked purple in the distance. No one in their right mind would want it, but Jack was not shopping from a position of right mind. He was shopping from eviction and desperation, and the understanding that 4 walls and a roof, even condemned walls and a collapsing roof, were better than sleeping in a truck with a son who had nightmares and deserved better than a father who could not keep a home. The auction happened on a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse, a room full of investors and developers bidding on properties they would flip for profit or hold for appreciation or tear down for salvage. Jack stood in the back, holding the $850 in cash he had scraped together from his final paycheck, praying that no one else wanted a condemned ranch badly enough to bid against him. Praying that for once, being poor might be an advantage, might mean wanting something that richer men had the sense to avoid. Ethan stood beside him, small and quiet in the way he got when the world felt too big and uncertain. Jack had told him they were going on an adventure, were going to buy a ranch like great-grandpa Frank used to have. Ethan had nodded with the solemn understanding of children who have learned not to ask questions that might have answers they do not want to hear. Now he held Jack's hand and watched men in business casual bid thousands of dollars on properties with straight faces, like money was just a thing you had instead of a thing you bled for. The auctioneer moved through properties quickly, each one drawing multiple bids that drove prices up into ranges that made Jack's $850 feel like pocket change. A foreclosed house in town went for $12,000. A commercial lot near the highway went for $35,000. A ranch with actual utilities and road access went for $90,000 to a developer who looked bored while bidding. The room had the energy of a farmer's market, casual and transactional, people buying and selling pieces of Wyoming like they were trading baseball cards. When Anderson Valley Ranch came up, the auctioneer's tone changed, shifted from the smooth patter of selling valuable assets to the resigned monotone of fulfilling legal requirements with property everyone knew was worthless. Next item, Anderson Valley Ranch, 420 acres with structures, built 1897, various additions through 1972, structures condemned per county inspection, no utilities connected, access by unmaintained 2-track road, easement status unclear, buyer responsible for all back taxes, estimated at $4,000 over 3 years, and any demolition costs for hazardous structures. Environmental assessment not completed. Sale as is, no warranties, no representations. The auctioneer paused, looked out over the room with the expression of a man who knew what came next. Minimum bid $850. Do I have $850? Jack raised his hand, felt every eye in the room turn toward him, felt the weight of being the poorest person present, the only one desperate enough to want land that was more liability than asset. A few people smiled. Not cruel smiles exactly, just the recognition of someone making a choice born from circumstances they were glad not to share. No one else bid. The auctioneer called it twice more, his voice echoing in the suddenly quiet room. $850 going once, $850 going twice. The gavel came down with a sound like a door closing. Sold for $850 to bidder 47. See the clerk for paperwork. Just like that, Jack owned property. Condemned, worthless, inaccessible property, but property nonetheless. A place where he and Ethan could sleep without asking permission, without facing eviction, without depending on systems that could not help families like theirs. He walked to the clerk's window, feeling lighter than he had in months, even knowing that light was probably foolish, was probably the feeling you get right before discovering that hope was just another kind of debt you could not afford to carry. The clerk was a woman in her 60s, with the efficient sympathy of someone who had processed 1,000 small tragedies. "First time buying at auction?" she asked while pulling up the property records. "Yes, ma'am." "You know the structures are condemned, right? Means you cannot legally occupy them. If someone gets hurt on the property, you are liable. If the county decides they are a hazard, you pay for demolition." "I understand." She looked at him, really looked, the kind of look that saw past the surface to the desperation underneath. "You have a plan for this place?" "Working on it," Jack said. She slid the deed across the counter. 420 acres in Anderson Valley, mineral rights excluded, transferred to Jack Morrison for $850 plus $4,000 in back taxes payable over 12 months. His name on a property deed for the first time in his life. The Morrison family owning land again after 46 years of renting and borrowing and making do with nothing. "Good luck," the clerk said, and from the tone she meant it. The drive to the ranch took them down roads that got progressively worse, pavement giving way to gravel giving way to dirt that was more suggestion than surface. The truck bounced over ruts deep enough to scrape the undercarriage. Ethan gripped the door handle and did not complain, had learned over 2 years that complaining did not change circumstances, just made the adults more tense. The GPS lost signal 15 minutes from the highway. Jack navigated by landmarks and guesswork, following directions the clerk had written on the back of a gas station receipt. The valley opened up in front of them like something from a postcard, the kind of Wyoming landscape that made people move west in the first place. Mountains rising on 3 sides, peaks still holding snow in late August. A creek cutting through the valley floor, willows marking its path in green against the brown of high desert scrub. The sky was enormous, that big sky country emptiness that made a man feel small in a way that was somehow comforting, like being small meant your problems were small too, even when they were not. The ranch sat at the valley's north end, tucked against the foothills where the land started climbing toward the mountains. The 2-track road leading in was barely visible through sage and rabbit brush that had reclaimed what might once have been cleared grazing land. Jack put the truck in low gear and crept forward, branches scraping the paint, rocks pinging off the skid plate. Half a mile in, the buildings came into view. The main house was worse in person than the auction photos suggested. 2 stories of log construction from a time when people built to last, but time had outlasted the builders. The roof had collapsed inward, taking most of the second floor with it. Windows were empty sockets. The front porch sagged like a broken jaw. Vines had grown up the walls and through the windows, nature reclaiming what humans had abandoned. But the barn stood. It was massive, easily 100 feet long and 40 feet wide, built from hand-hewn timbers that had come from trees that were probably old growth when they were cut. The roof sagged in the middle and the siding showed gaps where boards had fallen away, but the structure itself still held form. The massive sliding door hung crooked on rails thick as a man's wrist. The whole thing leaned slightly to the east, like a drunk leaning into wind, but it had not fallen. Had stood here since at least the 40s based on construction style, had outlasted the house, and the people who built it, and the economy that had made ranching profitable in this valley. Jack pulled the truck up next to the barn and killed the engine. The silence that followed was complete. No highway noise, no neighbors, no sound except wind moving through sage and the distant call of a hawk somewhere up the valley. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt and looked at the barn with an expression Jack could not quite read. "Is this really ours?" Ethan asked quietly. "Yeah, buddy, this is really ours. It looks like it is going to fall down. It has looked like it is going to fall down for probably 50 years, but it has not fallen yet." They got out of the truck and approached the barn carefully, Jack testing each step before letting Ethan follow. The ground was uneven, scattered with debris and rusted equipment from decades past. A broken harrow, a water tank with the bottom rusted out, sections of wire fence coiled like sleeping snakes. The barn door was stuck, swollen from moisture and time. Jack put his shoulder into it and shoved. The door screamed on its rails but moved, opening onto darkness that smelled of earth and rot and something else underneath, something dry and preserved. Light streamed through gaps in the walls, creating patterns that shifted as they moved inside. The interior was a cathedral of decay. Massive timbers rose 30 feet to rafters that still looked solid despite decades of weather. The floor was dirt, packed hard as concrete from years of use and compression. Stalls lined one wall, built for horses or cattle, the wood smooth from countless animals rubbing against it. Hay bales disintegrated in corners. Bird nests filled the rafters. A ladder led to a loft where more light filtered through holes in the roof. Ethan walked to the center of the barn and turned in a slow circle, head tilted back to see the full height of the space. "It is like a castle," he said. "It is like a barn that needs a lot of work," Jack said, but he smiled when he said it because Ethan was right. There was something castle-like about it, something fortified and strong, like the people who built it expected it to stand against whatever came. They spent the afternoon exploring. Jack assessed what was salvageable and what was dangerous. The main timbers were solid, old-growth Douglas fir or ponderosa pine that had hardened with age into something nearly petrified. The roof needed complete replacement, but the framing underneath could hold it. The siding was more gaps than boards, but that was fixable. The foundation was stone, laid without mortar in the old way, settled into the earth like it had grown there. It was while examining the foundation on the barn's north side that Jack noticed something that did not fit the pattern. A section of concrete, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, poured up against the barn's back wall. It was newer than the barn by decades, probably poured in the 60s or 70s based on how the surface had weathered. But there was no structure on it, no equipment, nothing that explained why someone would pour a concrete pad this size and then build nothing on it. Jack walked the perimeter, his engineer's eye picking up details. The concrete was thick, at least 8 inches based on the exposed edge. Rebar visible at the corners, heavy gauge. The pour was professional, smooth finish, proper control joints. This was not a DIY project. Someone had paid to have this done right. But for what? He walked back to the truck and grabbed his old rebar detector from the tool box, a magnetic scanner he had used in the army for finding buried ordnance. ran it over the concrete in a grid pattern. The needle jumped immediately. Massive amounts of metal underneath. Not just rebar for the slab, but heavier concentrations. Structural steel, arranged in a pattern that looked like a frame. Jack stood back and looked at the pad from different angles. The concrete sat lower than the surrounding ground by maybe 6 inches, like the excavation had gone deeper than necessary for a slab. The barn wall above it showed newer mortar between stones, like someone had repaired or reinforced the foundation in the same era as the concrete pour. Understanding hit him like cold water. This was not a foundation for something that was never built. This was a roof. Someone had built something underground, something substantial enough to need steel reinforcement and proper engineering. Something they wanted hidden, and they had hidden it behind a barn in a valley that would be abandoned 20 years later, on land that would change hands 6 times over 50 years, and somehow never be developed or torn down or examined too closely. Jack walked back to the truck, where Ethan was sitting in the bed looking at clouds. "Hey, buddy, how do you feel about a little digging?" They spent 2 days excavating around the edges of the concrete pad. Jack used a shovel from the barn, and Ethan helped move dirt with a small garden trowel they found in the truck. Slow work in the late summer heat, breaking through caliche and hard pack, but Jack had dug plenty of holes in the army, and this one had purpose beyond following orders. 3 feet down on the east side, his shovel hit metal. He cleared dirt away carefully, exposing a steel door set into concrete, hinges massive and industrial, padlock rusted but still holding. The door was 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, set at an angle like a storm cellar entrance. It had been well made, the kind of construction you saw on Cold War-era bunkers or military installations. Someone had spent serious money building whatever this was. Someone had wanted it to last and to stay hidden. Jack used bolt cutters from town to remove the padlock. The lock snapped after 3 tries, metal brittle from decades of weather. He pulled the door open, hinges screaming protest, and looked down into darkness that seemed to swallow light. A concrete staircase descended 12 feet, disappearing into black. Cool air rose from below, smelling of dust and something chemical, like old preservatives or treated wood. "Stay here," Jack told Ethan. "I want to come. Not until I know it is safe." Jack grabbed a flashlight from the truck and descended the stairs, each step careful, testing for stability before committing his weight. The stairs were solid. At the bottom, his flashlight beam revealed a space that made his breath catch. An underground room, maybe 25 feet by 30 feet, with reinforced concrete walls and a ceiling supported by steel I-beams. The floor was concrete, smooth and level. The air was dry, temperature constant, like the earth itself was climate control. Shelving units lined the walls, military surplus from the look of them. A desk sat in one corner, drawers slightly open. Filing cabinets stood against the far wall, and on the shelves, stacked and organized with the precision of someone who expected to come back, were the contents of a life's work. Cash, bundles of it wrapped in plastic, vacuum sealed against moisture. $100 bills, $50 bills, even some old $20 gold certificates from before the government recalled them. Jack picked up one bundle. The bills inside were crisp, preserved, dated to the 1950s and 60s. He set it down and moved to the next shelf. Gold, American Eagle coins in tubes. Small bars stamped with dates and weights. Nothing huge, nothing that screamed treasure, just the steady accumulation of someone who bought precious metals when they had extra money and saved it against a future they might not live to see. Jack moved to the filing cabinets, his hands shaking now with something that was not quite adrenaline and not quite fear. The cabinets were locked, but the keys hung from a hook on the wall, tagged with labels in careful handwriting. He opened the first drawer. Files, hundreds of them. each one a property deed or mineral rights document or contract, organized alphabetically by family name. Jack pulled one at random. Henderson Ranch, 160 acres, mineral rights agreement dated 1948. The document showed the Henderson family retaining 75% of mineral rights, leasing 25% to Mountain States Exploration Company for oil and gas development. The signatures looked official, notarized, legitimate. He opened another file. Johnson Ranch, same type of agreement, 75% mineral rights retained by the ranching family. Then another, Morrison Ranch. He stopped breathing. Morrison Ranch, 640 acres. Frank Morrison, owner. Mineral rights agreement dated 1952. Terms: Morrison family retains 75% of mineral rights in perpetuity, leases 25% to Mountain States Exploration for 20-year term, renewable at family's option. His grandfather's ranch, the one Frank lost in 1978 to bankruptcy, the one that started the Morrison family's long slide into poverty. And here was a document saying Frank owned 75% of any oil or gas under that land. Jack's engineering mind started working through implications even as his heart hammered in his chest. If Frank owned the mineral rights, they should have passed to his estate when he died. Should have gone to Jack's father, then to Jack. Should have been worth something, should have been found during the bankruptcy proceedings, should have kept Frank from losing everything. Unless someone had made sure they were not found. Jack pulled more files. 31 properties in Anderson Valley and surrounding counties, all with the same type of mineral rights retention, all dated between 1945 and 1955, all showing families keeping most of their mineral rights while leasing small percentages to exploration companies. He opened the second filing cabinet. More files, but these were different. These were labeled County Records Comparison and dated 1971 through 1972. Inside were photocopies of the same mineral rights documents, but with differences. The county recorded versions showed ranching families selling all their mineral rights for tiny amounts, $500, $800, amounts that made no sense if oil and gas were actually present. Someone had filed forged documents at the county courthouse, had replaced the real agreements showing families retaining rights with fake agreements showing families selling rights for almost nothing. And whoever had done it had been systematic about it, had hit 31 properties over a span of 15 years, had built a fortune on stolen rights that families never knew they owned. Jack found a folder labeled Evidence Collection and opened it. Inside were photographs, ledgers, affidavits, photos of a man in expensive ranch clothes meeting with a county clerk outside the courthouse. Ledger entries showing payments, thousands of dollars, lined up next to dates and names. Affidavits from ranch hands describing conversations they had overheard, document changes they had witnessed, threats they had been afraid to report. And at the bottom of the folder, a letter, handwritten on yellowed paper, dated March 1972. To whoever finds this vault, my name is Duke Anderson. I have ranched in this valley since returning from the Pacific in 1946. I built this vault in 1951 to protect documents that prove systematic theft of mineral rights from 31 ranching families by Warren Sutton and his oil company. Warren bribes county officials to lose original deeds and file forgeries showing ranchers signed away rights for pennies. I have collected proof. Photographs of bribes being paid, testimony from witnesses, the original mineral rights agreements that show what families actually own. I am 68 years old. Warren Sutton has made threats against me, has told me that accidents happen on ranches, that old men die in their sleep or under tractors or in barn fires. I have told him I have insurance, that if anything happens to me, the evidence will surface. But I am dying of cancer and I know my time is short. If I am found dead before this reaches proper authorities, No, it was not accident or illness. It was murder to protect theft. The cash and gold in this vault represent 20 years of savings. Use it to fight, hire lawyers, pay investigators, restore what was stolen. The families on this list deserve the truth. They deserve their rights returned. Warren Sutton has built an empire on fraud. Do not let him bury the evidence with me. Duke Anderson, March 1972. Jack stood in the vault holding a letter from a dead man, his grandfather's name on a list of victims, evidence of 50 years of theft sitting on shelves in a room that had waited in darkness for someone desperate or lucky enough to stumble into it. The cash and gold alone were probably worth millions, but the documents, the proof they contained, those were worth something that could not be measured in money. They were worth justice for families who thought they had just been unlucky, who blamed themselves for failures that were actually crimes. Above him, he heard Ethan calling. "Dad, are you okay? You have been down there a long time." Jack looked around the vault one more time, at the carefully preserved evidence, at the cash and gold that Duke Anderson had left to fund a fight against men who had built fortunes on stolen rights, at his grandfather's name on a list of victims, at the proof that the Morrison family's poverty had not been Frank's fault, had been theft dressed up as legitimate business. He climbed the stairs back into daylight. Ethan stood at the top, worry on his young face. "I found something," Jack said. "What?" "A way to finish what your great-grandfather started." In the distance, the sound of engines carried on the wind. Jack looked up the valley and saw dust rising from the two-track road. 3 black SUVs were approaching, moving fast for the rough road, kicking up rooster tails of dirt behind them. They had the look of vehicles that cost more than most people made in a year. The kind of vehicles that belonged to people who were used to getting what they wanted. The SUVs pulled up in front of the barn and stopped in a line, doors opening in unison like a choreographed military operation. 6 men emerged. 5 wore suits too nice for ranch country. The 6th man, older than the others, wore expensive ranch wear, the kind of Western clothing that cost thousands and looked exactly like the cheap versions from a distance but signaled wealth to anyone who knew the difference. The older man walked forward with the confident stride of someone who owned the ground he walked on even when he did not. He was maybe 58, silver hair, weathered face, the look of a man who had spent time outdoors but had spent more time in boardrooms. He stopped 10 feet from Jack and smiled with teeth that were too white to be natural. "You must be the fellow who bought the Anderson place at auction," he said. His voice had the smooth warmth of a radio host or a politician, friendly in a way that felt practiced. "Name is Clayton Sutton. My family has deep roots in this valley. My grandfather Warren knew Duke Anderson, actually. They were good friends back in the day." Jack said nothing, just looked at Clayton Sutton and thought about the letter in the vault, about Warren Sutton bribing officials and threatening old men, about Duke Anderson dying under a tractor 3 months after writing that letter. "When Duke passed away," Clayton continued, "some family items ended up on this property. Business records, old documents, things with sentimental value to the Sutton family. We had lost track of where they ended up, but when we heard the property sold, we thought we should reach out." "What items specifically?" Jack asked. "Records, business papers, sentimental value to the family." "I have not found anything like that." Clayton's smile did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, something that reminded Jack of the moment before contact in combat, when friendly conversation stopped and violence became inevitable. "Let me be direct," Clayton said. "You paid $850 for this place. I will give you $15,000 cash today. That is a substantial profit on 1 day of ownership. You can take the money, find a better property, and we all walk away happy." Property is not for sale. Mr. Morrison, I do not think you understand the situation. This land has complications, easement issues, mineral rights disputes, environmental concerns that could cost you hundreds of thousands to remediate. Fighting those issues takes money and time that a man in your circumstances probably does not have. The threat was subtle but clear. We know you are broke. We know you cannot afford a fight. Take the money or we will make you regret it. Behind Clayton, one of the other men stepped forward. Older than the rest, maybe late 60s, with the flat eyes of someone who had done violence and was comfortable with it. He wore a security company jacket but had the bearing of law enforcement or military. Mr. Morrison, I am Tom Yates, the man said. I handle security for Sutton Energy. Mr. Sutton is making you a very generous offer. Most folks in your situation understand that taking the smart deal is better than fighting battles you cannot win. Jack looked at the 6 men, looked at their expensive vehicles and expensive clothes, and the casual certainty that money and power would get them what they wanted. Thought about his grandfather losing everything, about Duke Anderson dying under a tractor, about 50 years of families being robbed while men like Clayton Sutton built empires on theft. Get off my property, Jack said quietly. Clayton's smile finally dropped. The mask slipped just enough to show the real face underneath, the one that did not accept being told no. You are making a mistake, Clayton said. You do not know what you have stepped into here. Do not know the forces you are dealing with. Take the 15,000 while the offer stands. I said get off my property. For a long moment, the men just stood there. Then Clayton nodded to the others. They walked back to the SUVs without hurry, without apparent concern, just the easy confidence of people who knew this was not over, who knew they had time and resources and methods for dealing with stubborn people who did not understand how the world actually worked. Before getting into his SUV, Clayton turned back. Think about your son, Mr. Morrison, he said. Think about what is best for him. You have my card. Use it before you make decisions you will regret. The SUVs drove away, disappearing up the valley in a cloud of dust that hung in the still air long after they were gone. Jack stood with his hand on Ethan's shoulder and watched them go. His son was trembling. Are they going to take our ranch? Ethan asked. No, Jack said. They are going to try, but we are not going to let them. He looked back at the barn, at the vault hidden beneath concrete, at the evidence Duke Anderson had preserved for 50 years, waiting for someone to find it, waiting for someone willing to fight. Jack Morrison had spent 2 years running from grief and debt and failure, had spent his whole life watching the Morrison family lose everything to forces they could not control. But here, on 420 acres of condemned property bought with the last money he finally had something worth fighting for. Not just for himself, not just for Ethan, but for his grandfather Frank, for Duke Anderson. For 31 families who had been robbed of their inheritance by men who thought power meant being able to take what you wanted without consequence. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the valley in gold and shadow. The barn stood dark against the light, timbers holding strong after 70 years, roof sagging but not fallen, a monument to people who built things meant to last. Inside the vault, evidence waited. Outside, enemies circled, and between them Jack Morrison made a choice. He would not run, not this time, not from this. The valley was silent except for wind and the distant cry of hawks. Somewhere in that silence was the future. Jack did not know if it held victory or defeat, wealth or ruin, justice or just more loss. But he knew it held a fight. And after 2 years of running, a fight felt like hope. He put his arm around Ethan's shoulders and walked back toward the barn. They had work to do. A vault to secure, evidence to document, a case to build, and a war to prepare for against people who had been winning for 50 years but who had never faced someone with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The Anderson Valley had kept Duke's secret for 54 years. Tomorrow, Jack would start the work of making that secret matter, of turning hidden truth into public justice, of finishing what his grandfather and Duke Anderson had started. But tonight, he and Ethan would sleep in the barn that was now theirs, on land that carried their name on a deed, in a valley that held ghosts and gold and the promise that sometimes, if you were desperate enough and stubborn enough and willing to stand when wiser men would fold, you might find exactly what you needed in the last place you thought to look. The mountains turned purple in the fading light. The stars began to show, bright and close in the thin air. And in the barn, Jack Morrison sat with his son and felt something he had not felt since Sarah died. He felt like the fight might actually matter, like standing up might make a difference, like the Morrison family story might have chapters that did not end in loss. The vault waited in darkness below. Tomorrow would bring complications he could not predict. But tonight, in the silence of a tobacco barn that shouldn't have been standing, holding secrets it shouldn't have protected, Carter Hayes slept knowing that he and his son were no longer homeless, that they owned something no one could take from them, that the impossible had happened, and now he had to figure out what to do with the gift or burden, or both that $850 had purchased. Jack spent the first night after Clayton Sutton's visit sitting guard over the vault entrance with a shotgun across his lap and Ethan sleeping in the truck behind him. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by every sound the wind carried across the valley. Coyotes yipping in the distance, owls hunting from the barn rafters, the creak and groan of old timber settling under its own weight. Every sound could be footsteps. Every shift in the darkness could be men coming to take what Duke Anderson had died protecting. When dawn finally broke over the eastern mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and purple that belonged on postcards, Jack felt the weight of the shotgun in his hands and understood something fundamental about the fight ahead. Clayton Sutton had not driven out here with 5 men just to make an offer. He had come to assess the situation, to measure Jack's resolve, to plant seeds of doubt about fighting battles against enemies with unlimited resources. The $15,000 offer was never meant to be accepted. It was meant to establish a baseline, to show Jack what walking away looked like so that, when things got harder and the pressure mounted, he would remember there had been an easy exit he chose not to take. But Jack had not survived a decade in the Army and 2 years of grinding poverty by being easy to intimidate. He had learned young that fear was just information, a signal that something mattered enough to be scared about. And the vault beneath the barn mattered more than anything had mattered since Sarah died. Not because of the money, though the cash and gold represented security he had never known. The vault mattered because Duke Anderson had trusted that someone would find it, would have the courage to use what was inside to finish the fight Duke could not complete. And Jack's grandfather Frank had been part of that fight, had been working with Duke to expose the fraud, had lost everything when Duke died, and the evidence disappeared into a vault no one could find. This was not just about mineral rights or money. This was about finishing what his grandfather started, about proving that the Morrison family's poverty had not been earned through failure but imposed through theft, about showing Ethan that standing up to powerful men was not foolish idealism but necessary dignity. The sun climbed higher. Ethan woke up in the truck, climbed out yawning, asked if the bad men had come back. Jack said no. Did not say that the bad men were definitely coming back, just not yet. Not until they had tried other methods, legal threats, financial pressure, the systematic grinding down of resistance that men like Clayton Sutton had perfected over generations of getting what they wanted. Jack made breakfast on a camp stove, powdered eggs and instant coffee that tasted like cardboard but filled the stomach. They ate sitting on the tailgate watching the valley wake up, deer moving through the sage, hawks circling on thermals that rose from the warming earth. The ranch felt different in daylight, less like a condemned property and more like a fortress, isolated and defensible, the kind of place where a man could make a stand if he was stubborn enough. After breakfast, Jack drove into town, leaving Ethan with strict instructions to stay in the truck with the doors locked and the shotgun within reach. The drive took 40 minutes on the rough two-track road, then another 20 on paved highway into Clearwater, the county seat. Population 3,000, one stoplight, the kind of Wyoming town that existed because ranching and mining and oil had needed a place for supplies and governance before those industries mostly dried up and moved on. The county courthouse sat on the main square, a sandstone building from the 1920s with columns and steps and the accumulated gravity of a century of legal proceedings. Jack had been here 2 days ago for the auction. Now he returned with different purpose, walking past the courtroom where he had bought the ranch and down a hallway to the records office, where the county kept property deeds and mineral rights filings, and all the paper that proved who owned what in this corner of Wyoming. The clerk was the same woman who had processed his deed after the auction, the one who had warned him about condemned structures and liability. She looked up when he entered and something shifted in her expression, recognition mixed with what might have been sympathy or concern. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "back already. I need to pull some records, property ownership history, mineral rights filings, estate documents." "Which property?" "All of them in Anderson Valley. 31 properties. And I need to see the original deed filings from the 1950s, plus any amendments or transfers from the 70s through the 80s. The clerk's hand stopped moving on her keyboard. She looked at him with the careful neutrality of someone who had just heard a request that carried implications beyond the words. "That is a lot of records," she said slowly. "May I ask why?" "Research." "Research for what?" Jack met her eyes and made a decision about trust, about who to bring into the circle of knowledge before the fight went public. Research into whether those mineral rights transfers were legitimate or fraudulent. The silence that followed lasted maybe 5 seconds but felt longer. The clerk glanced toward the door, then back to Jack. When she spoke, her voice was quieter. "The originals from the 50s are in the archive. I can pull them, but you should know that people have requested those files before. Researchers, lawyers, family members trying to track inheritance. And every time there have been complications. Files go missing, archive rooms flood, budgets get cut and staff gets reassigned. The records you are asking for have a way of becoming unavailable when people start looking too close. But they exist. As of last inventory, yes. Whether they still exist when I go to pull them, that I cannot guarantee. I would like to find out." The clerk nodded and disappeared into the back. Jack stood in the waiting area looking at maps of the county on the walls, at the familiar contours of Anderson Valley and the surrounding ranges. 31 properties, 31 families, a systematic theft that had built an empire while destroying lives. And somewhere in this building were the documents that proved it, if those documents had not already been disappeared by people who had 50 years of practice making inconvenient evidence vanish. 20 minutes later, the clerk returned carrying 2 archive boxes. She set them on the counter and opened the first one. Inside were property deeds from the 1940s and 50s, filed in chronological order, each one a window into a time when ranching was profitable, and families built lives on land they expected to keep forever. Jack started reading. Each deed showed the same pattern Duke Anderson had documented in the vault. Mineral rights agreements where families retained 75% of subsurface rights, leasing only 25% to exploration companies for specific terms. The agreements were professional, properly notarized, signed by family patriarchs with names that still appeared on mailboxes around the county. Henderson, Yates, Morrison. Morrison, 640 acres sold by the previous owner to Frank Morrison in 1948, mineral rights retained in full. Agreement signed 1952 between Frank Morrison and Mountain States Exploration Company, giving the company access to 25% of any oil or gas discovered, with the Morrison family keeping 75% in perpetuity. Jack photographed the document with his phone, his hand steady despite the trembling in his chest. This was his grandfather's signature, Frank Morrison's careful handwriting on a legal document that should have made the family wealthy if oil was ever found. That should have been part of Frank's estate when he died. That should have kept the Morrisons from poverty. But when Jack asked for the amendments and transfers from the 70s, the pattern changed. The clerk pulled files from the second box, documents that showed a different story. In these versions, filed between 1972 and 1985, the agreements showed families selling all their mineral rights for pittances. $500, $800. Amounts that made sense only if the land was worthless, if no oil or gas existed, if families were desperate to get anything they could from rights that seemed to have no value. The Morrison file from 1978 showed Frank Morrison selling all subsurface rights to Sutton Energy Company for $1,200, signed and notarized just months before the bankruptcy that took the ranch. Jack looked at the two documents side by side. The original from 1952 showing Frank retaining 75%, the later filing from 78 showing Frank selling everything. The signatures looked similar but not identical. The notary stamps were different. The paper itself was different quality, the later version printed on stock that did not match documents from the 70s. These were forgeries, professional enough to pass casual inspection, but forgeries nonetheless. Someone had taken the original mineral rights agreements and replaced them with fabricated versions that transferred wealth from families to Sutton Energy. And they had done it systematically, property by property, building a fortune on fraud that would only be discovered if someone had both sets of documents to compare, which no one should have had, because the originals were supposed to be in the county archive, and once those were replaced with forgeries, there should have been no evidence that fraud had occurred, no way for families to prove they had been robbed, no trail leading back to whoever had orchestrated the theft. But Duke Anderson had kept copies, had documented everything, had built a vault to protect evidence that would wait 50 years for someone to find it and understand what it meant. Jack spent 3 hours photographing documents, comparing originals to amendments, building a digital record of fraud that spanned decades. The clerk helped, pulling files without comment but with an intensity that suggested she understood the implications of what they were uncovering. When Jack finally finished and thanked her for her assistance, she looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. "My maiden name was Henderson," she said quietly. "My grandfather lost his ranch in 1980, died thinking he had made bad choices, died believing it was his fault." Jack understood. Another family on the list, another victim of the Sutton fraud, another generation that had grown up in poverty because mineral rights worth millions had been stolen, and the theft had been so complete that even the victims believed they had simply failed. "I am going to make this right," Jack said. "They will destroy you for trying. You know that, right? Men like Clayton Sutton do not stay rich by letting people challenge them." "I know." "Then you are either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both." The clerk smiled for the first time, thin and sad but genuine. "My grandfather's name was William Henderson. If you make this right, if you restore what was stolen, you tell people his name. Tell them he was not a failure. Tell them he was robbed. I will. Jack drove back to the ranch with a phone full of evidence and a chest full of rage that felt cleaner than anything he had felt in years. This was righteous anger, the kind that came from seeing injustice clearly and knowing you had the power to fight it. His grandfather had not failed, had not made bad investments, had been systematically defrauded by men who built empires on theft and then rewrote history so the victims blamed themselves. The Morrison family poverty started with a crime, and crimes could be answered. Justice could be demanded. The fight ahead would be brutal, but it would not be pointless. Every hour spent battling Sutton Energy would be an hour spent defending Frank Morrison's name, proving that the grandfather Jack barely remembered had been worthy of the respect he never received. When he got back to the ranch, Ethan was sitting in the truck bed with the shotgun across his lap like Jack had left him, eyes alert, scanning the valley for threats. 8 years old and standing watch like a soldier. The sight made Jack's chest tight with pride and grief in equal measure. No child should have to carry this weight. But Ethan was a Morrison, and Morrisons carried weight whether they wanted to or not. At least now the weight meant something. At least now they were fighting back. "Everything okay?" Jack asked. "Nobody came. I watched like you said." "Good man." They spent the afternoon securing the vault, installing a better lock on the door and camouflaging the entrance with lumber and debris, so it looked like just another pile of ranch junk instead of access to evidence worth millions. Jack worked with the focused intensity of someone preparing for siege, checking sightlines, noting approaches, thinking through how to defend the property if defense became necessary. At sunset, a truck pulled up the two-track road, not the black SUVs from yesterday. This was a working ranch truck, 2 decades old, paint faded, the kind of vehicle that belonged in this valley. A woman got out, maybe mid-40s, dressed in jeans and a work shirt, dark hair pulled back, the weathered look of someone who had spent time outdoors. She walked toward the barn with the confident stride of someone who belonged here, who had rights that did not need to be explained. Jack stepped out to meet her, hand near the shotgun but not touching it. "Jack Morrison," she called. "That is me." "Sarah Reeves. I am a lawyer, heard you might need one." Jack relaxed slightly. The clerk at the courthouse had mentioned Sarah's name, had said she was the only lawyer in 3 counties who fought oil companies and won. "How did you hear that?" "County clerk called me. Said you were pulling records on Anderson Valley mineral rights. Said you looked like a man about to start a war with Sutton Energy. Wars need lawyers." "I have not decided to start anything yet." Sarah laughed short and sharp. "You bought Duke Anderson's ranch. You found whatever Duke left behind. Clayton Sutton showed up the next day with threats and money. You are already at war. You just have not started shooting yet." She said it with the certainty of someone who had fought this fight before. Jack studied her, looking for tells of trustworthiness in an encounter that felt too convenient. But something in her eyes was familiar, the same hardness he saw in the mirror sometimes, the look of someone who had lost things that could not be replaced and had turned the loss into fuel for fighting battles that mattered. "Why do you care?" Jack asked. "Because my father was Robert Reeves. He ranched 18 miles south of here, lost everything in 1984 to what the bank called bad debt, and what I know was Sutton Energy pressure on the county assessor. My father shot himself in 1986. I was 12. Watched my mother sell everything we owned to pay debts my father never actually owed. Grew up understanding that powerful people could destroy your life and make it look legal." She stepped closer, eyes locked on Jack's. "I went to law school on rage and student loans. Spent 20 years learning how to fight corporations, how to find the fraud they hide in legitimate-looking paperwork, how to make them bleed in court. and I have been waiting for someone to find Duke Anderson's evidence since I was old enough to understand what my father had been trying to prove when he died." Jack felt the pieces clicking together. Sarah Reeves, her father on the list in Duke's vault, another family destroyed by the same fraud that had destroyed Frank Morrison, another generation that had grown up with grief that was actually theft. "You knew about the vault." "I knew Duke was collecting evidence. My father worked with him. They were building a case together, going to file with the state attorney general. Then Duke died in a tractor accident that was not an accident. My father tried to keep going alone, but without Duke's evidence he had nothing but accusations. Sutton used their lawyers to crush him, forced him into bankruptcy, broke him." Her voice was level, but her hands were fists. "I have spent 20 years wondering where Duke hid the proof, wondering if it was buried with him or destroyed or lost. And then I heard you bought his ranch at auction and Clayton Sutton showed up the next day, which meant you found it, which meant the fight my father died trying to start can finally happen." Jack made a decision, pulled out his phone, showed her the photographs, the original mineral rights agreements, the forged replacements, the documents from Duke's vault proving systematic fraud across 31 properties over 15 years. Sarah went through the photos in silence, scrolling with increasing speed, her lawyer's mind processing implications and calculating legal strategies. When she looked up, her eyes were wet but her voice was steady. "This is everything. This is exactly what we need. Original agreements showing rights retention, county filings showing sales that never happened, documentation of the fraud pattern. With this, we can void every transfer, restore rights to the families, and prove that Sutton Energy was built on theft. Can we win?" Against unlimited money and political connections and lawyers who have been burying cases like this for 50 years? I do not know, but we can fight. And fighting is more than anyone has been able to do since Duke died. She held out her hand. "I will take this case pro bono. Actually, I will pay to take this case. Every filing fee, every expert witness, every cost that comes up, I will cover it. Because this is not about money for me. This is about proving my father was right. Proving Duke Anderson did not die for nothing. Proving that Robert Reeves and Frank Morrison and 30 other families were not failures, they were victims." Jack shook her hand. Her grip was firm, calloused, the hand of someone who worked as well as argued. "We are going to make a lot of powerful people very angry," Jack said. "Good, they have been comfortable too long." They spent the evening going through the vault contents in detail, Sarah photographing everything with the methodical precision of someone building a case. She had Jack walk through the discovery chronologically, documenting when he found what, establishing chain of custody for evidence that would be challenged in court. She examined the original mineral rights agreements, compared signatures to the forged versions, made notes about notary stamps and paper stock, and all the small details that would prove fraud. When they got to Duke Anderson's letter, Sarah read it 3 times before speaking. This is a confession that Duke knew he was going to be killed. This turns a property fraud case into a murder investigation. Murder from 54 years ago. Is that even prosecutable? There is no statute of limitations on murder in Wyoming. If we can prove Duke Anderson was killed to cover up the fraud, everyone who benefited becomes potentially liable, including Clayton Sutton, if he knew. You think he knew? I think his grandfather Warren orchestrated it. His father probably knew, and Clayton has been protecting the secret his whole life. Men do not show up the day after you buy property offering $15,000 unless they are desperate to hide something. She paused, then added what Jack had been wondering himself. Clayton has been tracking Anderson Valley property sales for at least 15 years. We found records showing Sutton Energy purchasing auction notifications, monitoring every foreclosure, every ownership transfer. They have been waiting for someone to buy Duke's ranch, waiting to see if the new owner would find what Duke hid. That is how they knew to come here so fast. They were not surprised you bought the property. They were terrified you might find the vault. Night fell while they worked. Jack made dinner on the camp stove, chili from cans that tasted better than it should have because it was shared with someone who understood the fight. Ethan ate quietly, listening to the adults talk about fraud and evidence and legal strategy, with the solemn attention of children who have learned that adult conversations sometimes determine whether you have a home tomorrow. After Ethan fell asleep in the truck, Jack and Sarah sat by the vault entrance drinking coffee that had gone cold, talking about what came next. Sarah explained the legal process, the filings they would need to make, the resistance they would face. She was honest about the odds, about how Sutton Energy would use every trick and delay and intimidation tactic that unlimited money could buy. But she was also honest about the strength of the evidence, about how Duke's documentation gave them weapons that previous challengers had not possessed. "We are going to destroy them," Sarah said quietly. "It might take years, it might cost everything we have, but we are going to prove what they did. We are going to restore those mineral rights, and we are going to make sure every family knows their parents and grandparents were not failures." Jack looked out at the valley, dark except for stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. "My grandfather died thinking he lost the ranch through his own mistakes, died without knowing he had been robbed. I want people to know Frank Morrison was a good man who got cheated. They will know, we will make sure of it." The sound of engines broke the night silence. Jack stood, reaching for the shotgun. Sarah stood with him, tense and alert. But these were not the SUVs from yesterday. These were motorcycles, 3 of them, running without headlights, approaching fast from the south. They cut their engines 200 yards out and coasted closer in silence. Jack could make out shapes in the starlight, 3 riders in dark clothing, moving with the coordination of people who had worked together before. They stopped at the barn's edge and dismounted. Jack chambered a round in the shotgun, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet. "This is private property. You are trespassing." The riders did not respond, did not run, just moved toward the vault entrance with purpose that meant they knew what they were looking for. Jack fired a warning shot into the dirt, the muzzle flashed bright as lightning. The riders scattered but did not flee, taking cover behind the barn and outbuildings. Sarah was already on her phone calling the sheriff. Jack moved to better cover, putting himself between the intruders and the vault. Ethan was awake now in the truck, scared but staying down like Jack had taught him. "Next shot will not be a warning," Jack called. One of the riders called back, voice muffled by a helmet. "We do not want trouble. Just leave and this ends." "This is my property. You leave." "Wrong answer." The riders mounted their motorcycles and started engines, headlights blazing on, pointed directly at Jack to blind him. They accelerated hard, splitting in different directions, circling the barn like wolves around prey. Jack tracked one with the shotgun but held fire, knowing that shooting at riders was different from warning shots, crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. Then he saw what they were doing. One rider had peeled off toward the truck where Ethan was hiding. Jack's vision went red. He ran toward the truck, shotgun up, ready to kill if the rider got close to his son. But the rider was not going for Ethan, was going for the truck itself. Dropped something as he passed, something small and cylindrical that rolled under the chassis. Then all 3 riders accelerated hard, engines screaming, tearing back down the 2-track road and disappearing into darkness. Jack reached the truck and looked underneath. A road flare, burning bright red, 2 inches from the fuel tank. He yanked the flare out and threw it as hard as he could, watched it arc through darkness and land in dirt 20 yards away. Checked the fuel tank for damage. No leak. No fire. Just the smell of burning magnesium and fear that made his hands shake. Sarah appeared beside him, still on the phone with dispatch. "They are coming, 10 minutes. 10 minutes felt like an hour. Jack held Ethan and scanned the darkness for riders who did not return. When the sheriff's department SUV finally arrived, lights flashing, Jack gave a statement to a deputy who looked barely old enough to shave. Described the attack, the motorcycles, the flare under his truck. The deputy took notes with an expression that said he was recording details he already knew would not lead anywhere. "Could you identify the riders?" "They wore helmets, dark clothing, no visible plates on the bikes." "Anything that might help us find them?" "One bike had a loud exhaust, custom pipes maybe, and they knew exactly where the vault entrance was. They were not random vandals, someone sent them." The deputy's pen stopped moving. "You have evidence of that?" "Just the timing. I buy this property 2 days ago. Clayton Sutton shows up offering to buy it back. I refuse. Now riders show up in the night trying to intimidate me off the land. You tell me if that is coincidence." "Mr. Morrison, making accusations against prominent citizens without proof is not going to help your situation." "My situation is that someone just tried to burn my truck with my son inside. I do not care about prominent citizens. I care about who sent those riders." The deputy closed his notebook. "I will file a report. We will investigate. But without identifying information, there is not much we can do. You should consider installing security cameras, and maybe think about whether owning this property is worth the risk." After the deputy left, Sarah stood with Jack in the dark looking at the burned-out flare on the ground. "That was a message," she said. "Not an actual attempt to hurt you. If they wanted the truck to burn, they would have used something more reliable than a flare that gives you time to put it out. They wanted you scared, wanted you thinking about Ethan's safety every time you consider fighting back. They made a mistake then." "How so?" "They showed me they are desperate. Showed me that Duke's evidence is dangerous enough that they will risk criminal charges to stop it from going public. Which means we have them scared. Which means we are winning." Sarah smiled in the darkness. "You sound like your grandfather. Frank used to say the same thing, that you knew you were on the right track when powerful people got desperate." Jack had no memories of Frank Morrison clear enough to compare, but the idea that he was carrying forward something his grandfather started felt right in a way that soothed the fear from the attack. This was legacy work. This was Morrison family business, and Morrisons did not quit just because the fight got hard. They spent the rest of the night taking shifts on watch. When dawn finally came, painting the valley in colors too beautiful for the ugliness of the fight, Jack made a decision. They needed to move faster, needed to go public with the evidence before Sutton Energy had time to destroy it or buy it or intimidate them into silence. "We file this week," Jack said. "Get the evidence in front of a judge, make it official record that cannot be disappeared. That means war. Once we file, there is no taking it back. Sutton will come at us with everything." "They are already coming at us. At least this way we fight on our terms." Sarah nodded and started making calls. Lawyers she trusted, judges who had reputations for fairness, local reporters who might cover the story if it was packaged right. Jack watched her work, this woman who had turned her father's death into fuel for fighting, who had spent 20 years preparing for this exact battle. The Morrison family had found an ally who understood that justice sometimes required rage. While Sarah made calls, Jack took Ethan for a walk around the property, checking fence lines and boundaries, doing the physical work that helped him think. They found old cattle chutes and loading pens, remnants of the ranch Duke Anderson had built in the valley when ranching was still profitable. Good construction, solid design, the work of a man who built things to last. Jack thought about Duke working this land for decades, building a life, collecting evidence against the fraud that was destroying his neighbors. Thought about the letter in the vault, Duke knowing he was going to die, trusting that someone would find what he left behind. 54 years Duke's evidence had waited. 54 years of families thinking they had failed when they had actually been robbed. But the waiting was over now. Jack Morrison had found the vault. Sarah Reeves had the legal expertise to use it, and between them, they had the rage and stubbornness to see this fight through regardless of cost. At the barn, Ethan showed Jack something he had found while exploring earlier, a loose brick in the vault wall. Behind it, a small space. Inside the space, a cassette tape in a plastic case, labeled in Duke Anderson's handwriting. Insurance. April 10, 1972. Jack carried the tape back to the truck where Sarah was still making calls, held it up so she could see. Ethan found this hidden in the vault wall. Sarah ended her call and took the tape, turning it over in her hands with the careful reverence of someone holding evidence that might change everything. "We need to hear what is on this." They drove to town, found a pawn shop that sold old electronics, bought a tape player for $20, drove back to the ranch and sat in the truck bed with the player between them while Ethan sat close, all three of them understanding that whatever was on this tape, Duke Anderson had thought it important enough to hide separately from everything else. Jack pressed play. Static, then Duke Anderson's voice, older but strong, speaking with the measured care of someone creating a record. "This is Duke Anderson. April 10, 1972, 11 p.m. I am recording this after tonight's meeting with Warren Sutton at the Cattleman's Bar in Clearwater. I am recording because Warren made threats that need to be documented." Pause, sound of ice in a glass. "Warren offered me $100,000 to lose the original mineral rights documents. Said the forgeries were already filed at the county. Said the families would never know the difference. Said I could take the money and retire comfortable instead of fighting battles I could not win. I refused." Another pause. When Duke's voice came back, it was harder. "Warren said I was making a mistake. Said I was an old man and accidents happen on ranches. Tractors roll over. Barns catch fire. Men die in their sleep and no one asks questions. Asked me if I had thought about my legacy, whether I wanted to die comfortable or die stubborn." The sound of Duke setting down his glass. "I asked him if that was a threat. He said it was a fact. Said men who cross him do not retire peacefully. Said he built Sutton Energy by knowing when to be generous and when to be final. Said I should think very carefully about which side of that line I wanted to be on." Silence, then Duke's voice, quiet but firm. "If I am found dead in an accident in the coming weeks, this tape is proof that Warren Sutton threatened my life. If my death is ruled accidental, investigate it as murder. The man is capable of anything." The tape ended. Sarah was already pulling up her phone, fingers flying across the screen. Duke Anderson died April 28, 1972, 18 days after recording this. Official cause of death was tractor rollover, ruled accidental. She looked at Jack with eyes that had gone hard as stone. "This is proof of conspiracy to commit murder. This changes everything." Jack thought about Duke making that recording, knowing his life was in danger, creating insurance that would outlive him by half a century. Thought about Warren Sutton making threats over drinks. so confident in his power that he spoke openly about making problems disappear. Thought about 18 days between threat and death, long enough for Duke to hide his evidence and short enough that the connection was obvious. "We need to find out who investigated Duke's death," Jack said. "If the investigation was genuine or if it was another cover-up." Sarah was already making notes, building the case that would turn property fraud into murder. This was no longer about just restoring mineral rights. This was about proving that Sutton Energy was built on a body, that Clayton Sutton's fortune rested on his grandfather killing a man who threatened to expose the truth. Jack looked at the barn, at the vault hidden beneath it, at the evidence Duke Anderson had collected and protected and left for someone to find. Duke had died trying to stop Warren Sutton. Frank Morrison had been destroyed trying to help. Robert Reeves had killed himself rather than live with losing everything to fraud he could not prove. But now the proof existed. Now the fight could finally happen, and Jack Morrison was exactly stubborn enough to see it through. While Sarah made more calls, contacting forensic experts and retired sheriffs and anyone who might remember the details of Duke Anderson's death, Jack found one more document in the vault. A folder labeled Legal Preparation, F. Morrison. Inside were letters between Duke and Frank Morrison, dated from 1971 through early '72. Frank had been gathering evidence for a class action lawsuit, had been working with Duke to build a case that would expose the mineral rights fraud and restore what was stolen. The letters showed a friendship built on shared purpose, two men who understood they were fighting enemies more powerful than themselves, but who believed justice mattered more than safety. The final letter from Duke to Frank was dated March 1972. "Frank, I am moving all evidence to the vault. Warren knows we are building a case. He has made threats against both of us. If anything happens to me, the vault contains everything you need to finish what we started. The combination is your daughter's birthday. Use it. Save the families. Do not let these bastards win." Jack's hands shook holding the letter. Duke Anderson had trusted Frank Morrison with the vault combination, had built his insurance around the Morrison family being the ones to finish the fight. But Frank had never found the vault, had been forced into bankruptcy 6 years after Duke died, had lost the ranch that bordered Duke's property, had moved away from Anderson Valley, had died without knowing the evidence existed. But now Jack had found it. The grandson Duke and Frank never got to see. The Morrison who would finish what his grandfather started. The circle was closing across 3 generations, and this time the ending would be different. Sarah found Jack in the vault, reading the letter between Duke and Frank. "I talked to a forensic pathologist who reviewed Duke's autopsy photos. Said the injuries were inconsistent with a tractor rollover. Said the pattern looked more like blunt force trauma followed by staging. Said if this happened today, it would be investigated as homicide." But it was not investigated as homicide. Because the sheriff in 1972 was on Sutton's payroll, because the coroner was afraid to challenge official narratives, because power meant being able to kill people and call it accident. Jack folded the letter and put it back in the folder with the care it deserved. "We are going to destroy them," he said quietly. "Not just beat them in court, destroy them. Make sure everyone knows what they did. Make sure Clayton Sutton spends the rest of his life knowing his fortune was built on murder." Sarah nodded. Duke and Frank would want that. They died trying to expose the truth. We are going to finish their work. They climbed out of the vault into afternoon light that felt too bright, too normal for the darkness they were about to bring into the open. Jack looked across the valley and thought about all the families who had lost everything. Thought about the children who grew up in poverty because their parents' wealth had been stolen. Thought about Frank Morrison dying at 61 thinking he had failed, never knowing he had been a victim. The fight ahead would be brutal. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Jack felt like his life had purpose beyond survival. He was going to restore his grandfather's name, going to prove that the Morrison family had been worthy all along, going to show Ethan that standing against evil was not foolishness, but the only choice worth making. The sun moved toward the western mountains. The valley prepared for night. And in the barn that Duke Anderson built, evidence that had waited 54 years was finally going to see daylight, going to be used the way Duke intended, going to finish the fight that murder had interrupted but not ended. Jack Morrison stood with his son and his lawyer in the lengthening shadows and felt the weight of 3 generations settle onto his shoulders. Frank Morrison's failure had been theft. Duke Anderson's death had been murder. Robert Reeves' suicide had been the cost of fighting alone. But Jack was not alone. He had Sarah's rage and expertise. He had Duke's evidence. He had his grandfather's legacy to defend and his son's future to build. He had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Clayton Sutton had made a mistake showing up with threats and money, had shown his hand too early, revealed that Duke's evidence was dangerous enough to fear. Now Jack knew the enemy was vulnerable, knew the fight was worth having, knew that justice delayed for 54 years was finally coming due. Tomorrow they would file. Tomorrow the war would go public. Tomorrow Sutton Energy would discover that the families they had robbed for decades had finally found someone willing to fight back. But tonight, in a barn that should have fallen but stood, holding evidence that should have been lost but survived, Jack Morrison allowed himself to believe that the impossible might actually happen, that David might beat Goliath, that right might overcome power, that a man with $850 and a condemned ranch might change the course of history. The stars came out one by one, the same stars that had watched Duke die and Frank lose everything, and Warren Sutton build an empire on theft. But now those stars were watching the beginning of something different, the beginning of justice, the beginning of truth, the beginning of the end for men who thought power meant never having to answer for their crimes. Jack put his arm around Ethan's shoulders and walked toward the truck, toward tomorrow, toward the fight that would define whether his life meant something beyond surviving. The Anderson Valley Vault had kept its secrets for 54 years. Now those secrets would shake the foundations of an empire, and Jack Morrison would make sure they shook hard enough to bring the whole structure down. The press conference happened on a Wednesday morning in the county courthouse meeting room, the same building where Jack had bought the Anderson Valley Ranch 9 days earlier for $850. 9 days that felt like a lifetime, that had transformed him from a man running from eviction into someone holding evidence that could topple an empire built on 50 years of fraud and murder. Sarah had arranged everything with the precision of someone who understood that first impressions mattered in battles fought as much in public opinion as in courtrooms. 3 local reporters showed up: the Clearwater Tribune, the regional Wyoming News Network affiliate, and a freelancer who covered rural issues for national outlets. Not a large crowd, but Sarah had explained that small-town stories needed careful seeding before they could grow into movements. One good article in the Tribune would reach every ranching family in 3 counties. One broadcast on the evening news would put Sutton Energy on defensive footing. And if the national freelancer picked up the story, it could bring pressure that even unlimited money and political connections could not fully deflect. Jack sat at a table with Sarah on his right and empty chairs on his left, waiting for the final piece Sarah had promised would make the story undeniable. The reporters set up cameras and recorders with the bored efficiency of people who had covered 1,000 county government meetings and planning commission hearings. They did not look like they expected anything remarkable. Just another rural property dispute, another family claiming they had been wronged, another lawyer promising justice that probably would not arrive. Then the door opened and an old man walked in, moving slowly with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had started failing but whose mind remained sharp. He was maybe 80, thin in the way of people who had been larger once, weathered skin hanging loose on bones that seemed too prominent. An oxygen tank rolled beside him on a small cart, clear tubing running to his nose. But his eyes were alert, and when he looked at the reporters, something in his expression made them sit up straighter and start paying closer attention. "This is Roy Tucker," Sarah said, standing to help the old man into the chair beside Jack. "Mr. Tucker worked on Duke Anderson's ranch in the 1970s. He has information about Mr. Anderson's death that has never been made public." The mood in the room shifted immediately. The reporters leaned forward, cameras focused. Roy Tucker settled into his chair and looked at each person present with the steady gaze of someone who had carried a secret for so long that, finally speaking, it felt like setting down a weight that had bent his spine. Sarah began by laying out the basic facts. Jack Morrison had purchased the Anderson Valley Ranch at foreclosure auction. During renovation of the property, he had discovered an underground vault containing evidence of systematic mineral rights fraud affecting 31 ranching families between 1972 and 1985. The fraud involved replacing legitimate mineral rights agreements with forged documents that transferred valuable subsurface rights to Sutton Energy for pennies on the dollar. The original agreements showed families retaining 75% of mineral rights. The forgeries showed families selling everything for amounts ranging from $500 to $2,000. Sarah presented photocopies of the documents, side-by-side comparisons that even non-lawyers could see were different. Different paper stock, different notary stamps, signatures that were similar but not identical. She walked the reporters through the evidence methodically, building a case that was less sensational speech and more courtroom presentation. This was not wild accusation. This was documented fraud. Then she played Duke Anderson's tape. The recording from April 10, 1972, Duke describing his meeting with Warren Sutton, the threats made over drinks, the choice presented between taking money and staying silent or dying stubborn. The room went completely silent. Even the cameras seemed to stop moving. Duke's voice filled the space, matter of fact and calm, a man documenting threats because he knew what was coming and wanted someone to know the truth after he was gone. When the tape ended, Sarah let the silence hold for a moment before speaking. Duke Anderson died 18 days after making that recording. The official cause of death was tractor rollover, ruled accidental, but the autopsy report, which we have obtained and had reviewed by a forensic pathologist, shows injuries inconsistent with that determination. The pathologist's opinion is that Duke Anderson's death should have been investigated as a homicide. She paused and looked at Roy Tucker. Mr. Tucker was present the day Duke Anderson died. He witnessed what actually happened, and he has agreed to tell that story today publicly for the first time in 54 years. Roy Tucker leaned forward slightly, hands gripping the edge of the table. When he spoke, his voice was rough from decades of smoking and age, but the words came clear and deliberate. April 28, 1972. I was mending fence on Duke Anderson's north pasture. I heard voices, angry voices, coming from near the equipment barn. I went to see if Duke needed help. I saw Duke arguing with Warren Sutton. Warren's foreman was there too, man named Carl Hoskins, big fella, mean. Warren was telling Duke this was his last chance, that Duke could take money and disappear, or he could have an accident like other men who did not know when to quit. Roy stopped and took a breath from the oxygen tank. The reporters waited, nobody moving, nobody interrupting. Duke told Warren he had already moved the evidence, that killing him would not stop the truth from coming out. Warren laughed, said truth did not matter if no one could find it, said Duke was an old man dying of cancer anyway, Might as well die rich and comfortable instead of stubborn and broke. Another pause. Roy's hands were shaking now. Duke turned to walk away. Warren nodded to Carl Hoskins. Carl picked up a shovel and hit Duke from behind, hit him hard across the back of the head. Duke went down. They dragged him to his tractor, positioned him like he had fallen under it when it rolled. Carl started the tractor and let it roll over Duke's body to make the injuries look right. The silence that followed was absolute. One of the reporters had stopped taking notes, just staring. The camera operator had gone pale. I was hiding behind the fence, too scared to help, too scared to run. I watched them kill Duke Anderson and I did nothing. Roy's voice cracked. Warren found me the next day, told me if I ever said a word, my wife and kids would have accidents too. Gave me $10,000 cash and told me to leave the valley and never come back. I took the money. I ran. I have been running for 54 years. He looked directly at the cameras. My name is Roy Tucker. I am 81 years old. I have lung cancer and maybe 6 months to live. I watched Warren Sutton order Duke Anderson's murder and I stayed silent because I was a coward and I was scared. But I am dying now anyway, so they cannot scare me anymore. Duke Anderson was murdered to cover up mineral rights fraud. Warren Sutton ordered it, and every dollar Sutton Energy has made since then was built on that murder. The press conference exploded after that. Questions rapid fire, reporters suddenly understanding they had stumbled into something bigger than a property dispute. Sarah fielded questions with practiced calm, directing attention to the evidence rather than speculation. Jack sat quiet, watching Roy Tucker handle the weight of confession with more dignity than seemed possible for a man admitting to decades of cowardice. When it finally ended and the reporters scattered to file their stories, Roy sat exhausted in his chair, oxygen tank hissing softly. Jack moved to sit beside him. "That took courage," Jack said. "That took dying," Roy corrected. "If I had 50 years ahead of me instead of 6 months, I would still be hiding. Do not make me a hero. I am just a coward who ran out of time to stay quiet. Duke's evidence would not mean anything without your testimony. The documents prove fraud, but your witness testimony proves murder. Together, they are enough to destroy Sutton Energy." Roy looked at Jack with eyes that had seen too much. "They will try to kill me before this gets to trial. You know that, right? We will protect you." Nobody protected Duke. The local news ran the story that evening. By morning, it had been picked up by the state wire service. By afternoon, national outlets were calling Sarah for interviews. The headline in the Clearwater Tribune was direct and devastating. "Local rancher's murder covered up for 50 years, witness says." The article included photos of the vault, copies of the forged documents, and Roy Tucker's full statement. The community response split exactly along the lines Sarah had predicted. Working families, people who remembered their grandparents losing ranches in the 70s and 80s, rallied around Jack and the evidence. But the business community, people whose livelihoods depended on Sutton Energy's operations and contracts and economic presence in the county, closed ranks to defend the company. The Chamber of Commerce issued a statement calling the accusations reckless and irresponsible. The county commissioners, 3 of whom had received campaign donations from Sutton interests, suggested the matter should be resolved quietly rather than through media spectacle. The church Jack's grandfather had attended before losing the ranch, a small Methodist congregation on the edge of town, held a prayer service for the families affected by the fraud. 60 people showed up, more than the building had seen in years. They prayed for justice and healing and truth. They collected money for a legal defense fund. They brought food to the ranch, casseroles and pies, and the practical support that rural communities offered when one of their own faced trouble. But the grocery store where Jack bought supplies started refusing his checks. The gas station attendant, who had been friendly suddenly, found reasons to be busy when Jack pulled up to the pump. The town was dividing, and Jack found himself on the side that had less money and less power, but more anger and more hunger for justice that had been denied too long. 3 days after the press conference, while Jack was in town buying supplies with cash because his checks were not accepted anymore, Roy Tucker was leaving his doctor's appointment in Clearwater. He walked slowly to his old pickup truck in the clinic parking lot, oxygen tank rattling on its cart, the same routine he had followed twice a week for months. He did not see the black truck that ran the red light at the intersection, did not have time to react before it hit his driver's side door at 40 miles per hour. The impact crushed the door inward, shattered the window, sent Roy's truck spinning into a light pole. The black truck kept going, did not stop, disappeared into traffic before witnesses could get a plate number. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. Roy was unconscious, bleeding from head wounds, ribs broken, lung punctured. They airlifted him to the regional trauma center in Casper, 90 miles away. Jack got the call from Sarah while he was loading groceries into his truck. He drove to Casper doing 90 on the highway, not caring about speed limits or safety, just needing to get there before Roy died, before the only living witness to Duke Anderson's murder was silenced the same way Duke had been. The trauma center was modern and clean, and filled with the controlled chaos of people trying to save lives. Jack found Sarah in the waiting room, pacing like a caged animal. Her face was pale, hands clenched into fists. "They induced a coma," she said. "Swelling in his brain, bleeding in his chest. They do not know if he will wake up." "What about the driver?" "Witnesses say the truck was new, black, no visible plates. Driver wore a baseball cap and sunglasses. Ran the light at full speed, hit Roy's door perfectly. Kept going without slowing down." "That was not an accident." "No, that was attempted murder." Jack thought about Duke Anderson, about tractor rollovers and accidents that were not accidents, about how Warren Sutton had perfected the art of killing people and making it look like bad luck. And now Clayton Sutton was using the same playbook, 54 years later, silencing witnesses before they could testify. But this time was different. This time Roy had already testified. His statement was recorded, transcribed, part of the public record. Killing him now would not erase what he had said, would only make it more credible, would transform attempted murder into proof that the accusations were true and dangerous enough to kill over. Sarah seemed to be thinking the same thing. "They made a mistake," she said. "This attack makes Roy's testimony more believable, not less, makes them look desperate, makes juries wonder what they are so scared of. If Roy lives to see a jury." They spent the night in the waiting room. Ethan slept across 3 chairs, exhausted from the stress of another crisis, another reminder that the fight they were in could cost more than money. Jack watched his son sleep and wondered if he was being selfish, if protecting his grandfather's legacy mattered more than protecting his son's safety. But then he thought about what kind of man he wanted Ethan to become, thought about whether teaching him to stand up against evil was worth the risk. Around 3 in the morning, a surgeon came out still wearing scrubs marked with Roy's blood. The news was cautious. Roy had survived the immediate crisis. The lung was repaired, the bleeding stopped, the swelling reduced. But the next 72 hours would determine whether he recovered or slipped deeper into the coma. Whether he would wake up at all was uncertain. Jack went to the window and looked out at Casper's lights spreading across the high desert, thinking about how many times in this fight they had come close to losing everything. The riders at the ranch, the flare under his truck, now Roy fighting for his life in intensive care. Clayton Sutton was escalating, using violence the way his grandfather had, trying to break their will before the fight reached a courtroom. But Jack had learned something in the army about will and breaking points. Fear was just information. Pain was temporary. What mattered was whether you had something worth fighting for that was bigger than the cost of fighting. And restoring justice for 31 families, proving that Duke Anderson and Frank Morrison had been murdered and robbed rather than failures, proving that Roy Tucker's 54 years of cowardice could be redeemed by one moment of courage, that was worth any cost. Sarah joined him at the window. "The state attorney general called me," she said quietly. "They are opening a formal investigation into Duke Anderson's death. Roy's testimony plus the tape plus the forensic evidence is enough to treat this as an active homicide case." 54 years later. Murder has no statute of limitations. If they can prove Warren Sutton ordered Duke's death, his estate is liable. His heirs are potentially liable. Everything Sutton Energy owns could be seized as proceeds from crime. Jack understood the implications. This was not just about mineral rights anymore. This was about unwinding an entire fortune, proving that every asset Clayton Sutton controlled had been gained through murder and fraud. That level of threat would make desperate men do desperate things. "We need protection," Jack said. "For Roy if he wakes up, for the families who might testify, for us. I talked to the FBI. Because this involves interstate mineral rights and potential federal land fraud, they have jurisdiction. They are assigning agents to the case." While they talked, Jack's phone buzzed, text from an unknown number. He opened it and felt his blood go cold. A photograph of the Anderson Valley Ranch, taken from high above, probably from a drone, and below it a message. "Accidents happen to more than old men. Think about your son." Jack showed Sarah the message. She went pale. "They are threatening Ethan." Jack's vision narrowed to a pinpoint of rage so pure it felt like clarity. He had fought Taliban fighters in Afghanistan, had dealt with poverty and grief, and every kind of hardship that life could throw at a man trying to raise a son alone. But threatening his child crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Clayton Sutton had just made the fight personal in a way that guaranteed Jack would not stop, would not compromise, would not show mercy even if mercy was offered. "I am going to destroy them," Jack said quietly. "Not just beat them, destroy them completely." Sarah nodded. "Good." They drove back to Anderson Valley as dawn was breaking, the sunrise painting the mountains in colors too beautiful for the ugliness of the war they were fighting. Jack had left the ranch in the care of 3 men from his grandfather's old church, veterans who had volunteered to stand watch while Jack was in Casper. They were sitting in lawn chairs outside the barn with rifles across their laps when Jack pulled up, alert and ready. Small-town solidarity in a fight against money and power. The vault was undisturbed. The evidence was safe. But Jack knew safety was temporary. Knew that Clayton Sutton would keep escalating until something broke. The question was whether Jack's resolve or Sutton's desperation would crack first. 2 days after Roy's hit and run, Sarah called with news that changed the entire scope of the case. A geological survey company had contacted her, asking if Jack would be interested in a mineral assessment of the Anderson Valley properties. The timing seemed suspicious until Sarah explained. The company had been hired by Sutton Energy in the 1990s to survey their holdings. But the survey results had never been published, never been filed with the state regulatory agencies that required disclosure of reserve estimates. The surveyor who had done the work was now retired and angry about how Sutton Energy had suppressed his findings. He was willing to provide his original survey data as part of the legal case. What he showed Sarah made her drive straight to the ranch to tell Jack in person. She arrived with documents and maps, spread them across a folding table in the barn while Jack and Ethan looked on. The maps showed the Anderson Valley oil field in detail, with drilling locations and estimated reserves marked in precise geological notation. The survey was done in 1995, Sarah said. Sutton Energy paid for it but never released the results. The surveyor says he was told the data was proprietary and confidential. He assumed that was normal business practice, but now he understands they were hiding the true value of the field. She pointed to numbers on the survey. The public estimates that Sutton Energy filed with the state show the Anderson Valley field contains approximately 4 million barrels of recoverable oil. Based on that estimate and current prices around $80 per barrel, the total field value is roughly $320 million. Jack did quick math. With 31 families holding 75% of mineral rights, that would be about $8 million per family. Life-changing money, but not generational wealth. But the actual survey, Sarah continued, shows reserves of 48 million barrels, 12 times larger than the public estimate. The number hung in the air like something too big to process. 48 million barrels at $80 each was $3.8 billion. 75% of that split among 31 families was $90 million per family on average, more for families with larger parcels. Jack sat down slowly. They have been hiding the real value for 30 years. Longer. This survey just confirmed what they probably knew in the 70s. The fraud was not just about stealing mineral rights. It was about stealing rights to one of the largest oil fields in Wyoming, and they have been systematically underreporting production and reserves to avoid paying higher royalties to the state. So when we restore the mineral rights to the families, we are not just giving them back what was stolen. We are making them wealthy. Very wealthy. And we are proving that Sutton Energy has been committing tax fraud and regulatory fraud on top of the original theft. The state will want every dollar they have been underpaid in royalties for 30 years. The federal government will want penalties for false reporting on federal lands. The families will have legitimate claims to decades of unpaid royalties based on actual production versus reported production. Sarah pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. Conservative estimate: Sutton Energy owes the state of Wyoming approximately $200 million in back royalties, owes the families closer to $1.5 billion in unpaid revenues. Between civil penalties, criminal fines, and legal fees, the total liability is probably north of $2 billion. She looked at Jack directly. Sutton Energy does not have $2 billion. If we win this case, the company goes bankrupt. Clayton Sutton loses everything, and the families get enough money to change their lives for generations. Jack thought about his grandfather Frank, dying broke and thinking he had failed. Thought about what it would mean to restore not just his reputation, but his family's fortune. Thought about Ethan growing up with educational opportunities and financial security instead of the poverty that had defined Morrison family life for 2 generations. But he also thought about the desperation this revelation would create in Clayton Sutton. If the fight had been dangerous when the stakes were millions, how much more dangerous would it become when the stakes were billions and total destruction of everything Sutton had? As if in answer, Jack's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered and heard Clayton Sutton's voice, tight with barely controlled rage. "You need to stop this, right now, before people get hurt." "People are already hurt. Roy Tucker is in a coma from your attempted murder." "I had nothing to do with that accident." "It was not an accident. Just like Duke Anderson's death was not an accident. Just like my grandfather's bankruptcy was not bad luck. You have been destroying families for 50 years and calling it business. That ends now. You do not understand what you are doing. Sutton Energy employs 400 people in this county, supports dozens of local businesses. If you bankrupt the company, you are not hurting me. You are destroying the entire local economy. Then you should have thought about that before you built your company on fraud and murder. Clayton's voice dropped to something colder. I am offering you one final chance. $5 million cash. You drop this case, turn over Duke's evidence, and walk away. Take the money and build a life for your son that does not involve looking over your shoulder for the rest of his childhood. Jack thought about the threat against Ethan, about the drone photo, about how men like Clayton used fear and money and pressure to break resistance. Your grandfather threatened Duke with accidents. You are threatening my son. Same playbook, different generation. But it is not going to work this time because I have something Warren never faced. I have proof. I have witnesses. I have public attention. And I have 31 families who are done being victims. Then you have chosen war. You chose war when you sent riders to my ranch, when you put a flare under my truck, when you tried to kill Roy Tucker. I am just finishing what you started. Clayton hung up. Jack stood holding the phone, feeling the weight of the choice he had just made. No compromise, no settlement, no mercy. This fight would go to the end, and only one side would survive it intact. Sarah was watching him with an expression that mixed concern and approval. He is going to come at us with everything now. Let him come. That evening, while Jack was securing the vault for the night, Ethan brought him something he had found while exploring the property. A small metal box buried in the dirt near the creek, corroded but intact. Inside was another cassette tape and a handwritten note. The note was dated June 1972, 2 months after Duke's death, in Frank Morrison's handwriting. If you found Duke's vault, you found the evidence, but you need to know the whole truth. Warren Sutton did not just kill Duke. He killed 3 other ranchers who were part of our group, made them all look like accidents, tractor rollovers, barn fires, one drowning, all within 6 months of Duke's death. All men who knew about the fraud and were planning to testify. I am next. I can feel it. They are squeezing me financially, forcing me toward bankruptcy. When I lose the ranch, they will probably kill me too, make it look like suicide from financial stress. This tape contains names and dates of the other deaths, proves the pattern. Use it. Finish what we started. Make them pay for every family they destroyed. Jack's hands shook holding his grandfather's note. Frank had known he was going to be destroyed, had documented it, had left evidence for someone to find decades later. And Frank had been right. He lost the ranch in '78, died of a heart attack in '82 that was probably the stress of losing everything and knowing it was murder disguised as business. Jack played the tape. Frank's voice, younger than Duke's had been, but carrying the same weight of a man creating insurance he hoped would outlive him. Frank named 4 ranchers who had died between April and September 1972, described their involvement in the fraud investigation, detailed the suspicious circumstances of each death, provided evidence that Warren Sutton had orchestrated a campaign of murder to silence everyone who knew about the mineral rights theft. This is genocide, Frank's voice said on the tape. Not of a people, but of a way of life. Warren Sutton is killing ranchers to steal their land and their rights, and he is getting away with it because he is rich and connected and people are too scared to stand against him. Someone has to stop this. Someone has to make the truth matter more than fear. I pray whoever finds this has more courage than I did, more strength to finish what Duke and I started. The tape ended. Jack sat in the barn with his grandfather's words echoing in the silence. 4 murders plus Duke made 5. Frank had died before they could kill him directly, but the stress and despair they caused had killed him just as surely. 5 families destroyed, 31 families robbed, 54 years of injustice compounding. But now the evidence existed. The pattern was documented, and Jack Morrison had every piece of proof needed to bring down an empire built on blood. Sarah arrived at the ranch an hour later, brought by Jack's call. She listened to the tape twice, took notes, started building the expanded case. 5 murders, 48 million barrels of hidden oil reserves, 2 billion in fraud. This was not a property dispute anymore. This was a conspiracy that touched every part of Sutton Energy's operations for half a century. "We need to give this to the FBI," Sarah said. "This is beyond state prosecution. This is organized crime. RICO statutes apply when there is a pattern of criminal activity conducted through a business enterprise. Murder, fraud, witness intimidation, tax evasion, all of it fits." They met with FBI agents the next morning in a conference room at the federal building in Cheyenne. 2 agents, both serious and methodical, taking notes while Jack and Sarah presented everything. The vault documents, Duke's tape, Roy's testimony, Frank's tape, the geological survey, the pattern of deaths. By the time they finished, the agents were looking at each other with expressions that said they knew they had stumbled into something massive. "We will need to take possession of the physical evidence," the lead agent said, "for chain of custody purposes, but we can provide you with certified copies for your civil case." "How long before you bring charges?" Sarah asked. "These cases take time, especially when they involve powerful people with resources to fight. Could be months, could be years." "Roy Tucker might not have years. He is 81 and in a coma from attempted murder. Which is why we are also opening a federal case on the hit and run, interstate flight to avoid prosecution. We will find the driver. We will connect them to whoever ordered the attack. And we will build this case piece by piece until it is airtight." Jack left the meeting feeling simultaneously hopeful and frustrated. The FBI was taking it seriously, but government justice moved slowly, and Clayton Sutton had shown he was willing to kill to protect his empire. How many more people would be hurt while the FBI built their careful case? When they returned to Anderson Valley, 3 news vans were parked outside the ranch. National media had picked up the story. The murdered rancher, the hidden vault, the multi-billion-dollar fraud. It had everything networks loved: drama and crime and underdogs fighting the powerful. Jack gave interviews, explained the evidence, told the story of families destroyed by theft disguised as business deals. The coverage was sympathetic, painted Sutton Energy as villains and the families as victims finally getting justice. That night, Clayton Sutton appeared on the local news with a prepared statement. He denied all allegations, called the accusations baseless and motivated by greed, claimed Jack Morrison was a con man trying to steal from a legitimate business by fabricating evidence and coaching false witnesses, promised that Sutton Energy would defend itself vigorously and that truth would prevail. But his performance was not convincing. His voice was too tight. His eyes were too hard. He looked like a man backed into a corner, fighting for survival rather than defending innocence. And the public was not buying it. Social media filled with support for the families. The state attorney general announced a formal investigation. 3 county commissioners who had defended Sutton suddenly called for transparency and accountability. The empire was cracking. The 50-year cover-up was failing, and Clayton Sutton was running out of options to stop it. 2 days later, Roy Tucker woke up, weak and confused and in pain, but conscious. The first thing he asked for was a lawyer. He wanted his testimony officially recorded while he still had strength. Wanted to make sure that if he died, his words would be part of the permanent record. Sarah brought a court stenographer to the hospital. Roy gave 4 hours of detailed testimony about Duke Anderson's murder, about Warren Sutton's threats, about the conspiracy he had witnessed and stayed silent about for 54 years. When he finished, Roy looked at Jack with tears in his eyes. I am sorry I ran. Sorry I stayed quiet while families suffered. Sorry I was not braver when it mattered." "You are brave now," Jack said. "That is what counts." "Will it be enough?" "It will be enough." The case was building momentum that felt unstoppable, evidence piling up, public pressure mounting, federal investigators circling. Clayton Sutton's options were narrowing to either surrender or escalate even further, and men who built empires on murder did not surrender easily. Jack stood in the barn that evening looking at the vault that had started everything. Duke Anderson had built this place to protect truth, had died believing the truth might never surface, but the truth was out now. The fight was public. The families were coming together, and justice that had been delayed for 54 years was finally, impossibly, within reach. The mountains turned purple in the sunset. The valley settled into evening quiet, and somewhere in that quiet was the sound of an empire beginning to fall, brought down not by superior force, but by stubborn refusal to let injustice stand. By a man who bought a condemned ranch for $850 and found 3 generations of evidence that the Morrison family had been worthy all along. Tomorrow would bring new battles, but tonight, Jack Morrison allowed himself to believe that the impossible was becoming inevitable, that David was actually beating Goliath, that his grandfather's name would be restored, and his son would grow up knowing that doing right mattered more than the cost. The vault waited in darkness, empty now of its treasures but full of the weight of its purpose fulfilled. Duke Anderson's insurance had paid off. Frank Morrison's evidence had mattered, and Jack Morrison was finishing what they had started, proving that some fights were worth having even when victory seemed impossible. The stars came out one by one, watching over a valley where justice delayed had finally become justice arriving, where truth buried had become truth triumphant, where families destroyed were becoming families restored. The Anderson Valley had kept its secrets for 54 years. Now those secrets were weapons in a war that would change everything for 31 families and destroy the empire that had stolen their futures. Jack walked toward the house where Ethan waited, toward tomorrow's battles, toward the finish of a fight that had started before he was born and would end with him standing victorious or broken, but certain he had given everything to the only cause that mattered, making the truth count, making justice real, making his grandfather proud. The fire started at 3 in the morning on a moonless night when the valley was black as the inside of a grave. Jack woke to the smell of smoke, that acrid chemical smell of accelerant burning hot and fast, and in the seconds it took his mind to process what his senses were screaming. He heard Ethan's voice calling from the barn where they had been storing equipment and tools, while the main house underwent repairs. "Dad, I am stuck." Jack was moving before conscious thought took over, running barefoot across gravel and dirt toward the barn that was already glowing orange from inside, flames visible through gaps in the weathered siding, smoke billowing from the loft. He could see Ethan's silhouette in the second-story window, small and panicked, trying to open a window frame that had been painted shut for decades. The barn's main door was already engulfed, flames climbing the old dry wood like water flowing upward. The side door was Jack's only option. He grabbed the first thing his hands found, an old horse blanket from the fence, dunked it in the water trough and wrapped it around his head and shoulders. The wool was heavy and soaked and smelled like algae and rust, but it was protection. Not much, but enough. The side door was hot to the touch. Jack kicked it open and was hit by a wall of heat that felt solid, like walking into a physical barrier. The interior was an inferno, flames eating through decades of accumulated hay and dried wood, the old timbers that had stood for 70 years turning into fuel for a fire that had clearly been set with professional intent. This was not accident. This was arson designed to destroy evidence and anyone who might be protecting it. Jack dropped low where the air was clearer and crawled forward, calling Ethan's name, following the sound of his son's cries toward the back of the barn where stairs led up to the loft. The stairs were burning but not yet consumed. Jack tested the first step, felt it hold, and climbed fast, the blanket over his head steaming from the heat, his lungs screaming for clean air that did not exist. The loft was a maze of old equipment and stored lumber, all of it burning or about to burn. Jack found Ethan huddled in the corner by the window, coughing, face streaked with soot and tears. The boy had been sleeping in the loft because he liked the height and the view of the valley at sunrise, never thinking that a childhood adventure would turn into a death trap. Jack grabbed Ethan and pulled him close, wrapping the wet blanket around both of them. The window Ethan had been trying to open was their only escape. The stairs they had climbed were already collapsing, flames consuming the old wood with sounds like gunshots. Jack picked up a steel pry bar from the floor and smashed the window frame, glass shattering, old paint cracking, the whole assembly coming loose. "We have to jump," Jack said. "It is too high. I will go first and catch you, trust me." Jack climbed through the window and hung from the sill, then dropped 12 feet to the ground, landing hard on packed dirt, ankle twisting but holding. He looked up at Ethan silhouetted against the orange glow of the burning barn. "Jump, I will catch you." Ethan hesitated for a moment that felt eternal, an 8-year-old boy being asked to leap into darkness and trust his father would be there. Then he jumped. Jack caught him, the impact driving them both to the ground, but Ethan was safe, breathing, alive. Jack dragged him away from the barn as the roof began to collapse, massive timbers crashing down in showers of sparks that rose into the night sky like malevolent stars. They made it 20 yards before the propane tank that had been stored in the barn exploded, the blast wave knocking them flat, heat washing over them like breaking surf. Jack covered Ethan with his body, felt debris raining down around them, chunks of burning wood and twisted metal landing in the dirt. When the immediate danger passed and Jack looked back, the barn was completely engulfed, flames reaching 50 feet into the air, the structure collapsing in on itself, with the groaning death sounds of something that had stood for generations finally giving up the fight. The volunteer fire department arrived 20 minutes later, too late to save anything, but able to keep the fire from spreading to the surrounding brush and buildings. Jack and Ethan sat wrapped in emergency blankets watching the barn burn down to its stone foundation, watching 70 years of history reduced to ash and ember, and the skeletal remains of timbers that had been trees before Duke Anderson was born. The fire chief walked over after the blaze was contained, his face grim in the flashing lights of the fire trucks. "Found evidence of accelerant, multiple points of origin. This was definitely arson." "I know," Jack said. "You have enemies." "You could say that." "Anyone specific come to mind?" Jack thought about Clayton Sutton's threats, about the drone photograph, about the message warning that accidents happened. Thought about how this was exactly the kind of escalation that came when desperate men ran out of legal options and turned to the same violence their grandfathers had used to build empires. "I have suspicions, but no proof you could use." The fire chief nodded, understanding the gap between knowing and proving. "Sheriff will want a statement, and you should know that whoever did this was not trying to scare you. They were trying to kill you. The accelerant pattern suggests they wanted the whole structure to go up fast with no time for escape. You and your son are lucky to be alive." After the fire trucks left and the sun started turning the eastern sky pale, Jack and Ethan sat on the tailgate of the truck looking at the smoking ruins where the barn had stood. Everything they had been storing there was gone. Tools and equipment and furniture salvaged from the collapsed house. But more than that, the barn itself was gone. the structure that had survived decades of weather and neglect, that had hidden Duke Anderson's vault, that had represented the Morrison family's return to owning land, reduced to a blackened foundation and the smell of destruction. Ethan leaned against Jack's side, small and exhausted. Are they going to keep trying to hurt us? Jack wanted to lie, wanted to tell his son that everything would be okay, that the danger was over. But Ethan deserved truth, deserved to understand what they were facing. Yes, they are desperate and desperate scared people do terrible things. Then maybe we should stop, maybe we should just leave. Jack understood the appeal. Take Ethan and run. Leave Wyoming and the fight and the danger behind. Start over somewhere Clayton Sutton could not reach them. But running meant abandoning 31 families to continued injustice. Meant letting Duke Anderson's murder and Frank Morrison's destruction go unanswered. Meant teaching Ethan that evil won when good people chose safety over standing up. Your great-grandfather Frank spent his life trying to fight these people. Died thinking he had failed. Your mom used to say that doing the right thing sometimes costs everything you have, and sometimes that is exactly the price worth paying. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that broke Jack's heart and put it back together at the same time. Mom would want us to finish it, even if it is scary. Yeah, she would. By noon, word of the fire had spread through the valley. By evening, people started showing up at the ranch. Not with sympathy cards or empty condolences, but with lumber and tools and the grim determination of rural communities that understood that when one of your own was under attack, you showed up to help them fight back. They came in pickup trucks and work vans, ranchers and carpenters and men who had grown up hearing stories about how their grandfathers lost everything in the 70s and 80s to forces they could not name or fight. They came because Jack Morrison had named those forces and was fighting them, and that fight belonged to all of them now. By the next morning, 40 men were on the property with levels and hammers and decades of building experience between them. This was going to be a barn raising, the old tradition of community coming together to replace what had been lost. Not out of charity, but out of shared understanding that attacks on one family were attacks on the values that held communities together. The foundation was still good, the stone base that Duke Anderson had laid in the 40s untouched by fire. They would build on that foundation, use it as the bones for something new. The design was simple and functional, a pole barn structure that could go up fast with volunteer labor. Nothing fancy, but it would be solid and it would be theirs, and it would be proof that burning down what Jack had built would not stop him from building again. Sarah showed up on the second day with food and legal documents, watching the construction with an expression mixing hope and concern. "This is beautiful," she said, looking at the men working together, the frame already rising 20 feet high. "But you know this just makes Clayton more desperate, right? He burned your barn and you rebuilt it in 3 days with community support. That is not the message he wanted to send." "Good, let him see that we are not backing down. That burning our buildings just makes us stronger." Stronger and more visible. The fire made national news. The community response is making national news. There are camera crews from Denver and Salt Lake requesting interviews. This fight is becoming bigger than just mineral rights or one family's ranch. Jack understood what she was saying. The story had transformed from local property dispute into something larger, a narrative about ordinary people standing against corporate greed, about communities defending their own, about justice delayed finally arriving. That narrative had power, but it also had danger. The more visible the fight became, the more pressure Clayton Sutton faced, and men under that kind of pressure did not surrender gracefully. While the barn raising continued, Sarah pulled Jack aside to discuss the legal strategy. The civil case was progressing through discovery, that pretrial phase where both sides requested documents and took depositions. Sutton Energy was fighting every request, objecting to every document demand, using procedural delays and legal technicalities to slow the process. Standard corporate defense tactics when you had unlimited money and lawyers who charged by the hour. But Sarah had weapons that previous challengers had not possessed. Duke Anderson's vault documents were contemporary records, created at the time of the fraud, not reconstructed from memory decades later. The tape recordings were Duke and Frank speaking in their own voices, creating evidence that juries would believe. And Roy Tucker's testimony, now part of the official record, provided eyewitness proof of murder and conspiracy. "We deposed Clayton Sutton yesterday," Sarah said. 4 hours of questioning under oath. "How did it go?" "He lied, repeatedly, about things we can prove are lies using the vault documents, about when he first knew about the fraud, about his grandfather's business practices, about the geological surveys. Every lie is potential perjury, and every perjury charge is leverage." She pulled out her phone and played a video clip from the deposition. Clayton Sutton sitting across from Sarah, his lawyer beside him, both men in expensive suits that signaled money and power. Sarah's voice on the recording was calm and precise. "Mr. Sutton, when did you first become aware that your grandfather Warren had filed fraudulent mineral rights documents in the 1970s? "I was not aware of any fraudulent documents. The mineral rights transfers were legitimate business transactions." "You have never seen the original agreements that Duke Anderson preserved showing families retaining 75% of mineral rights?" "I have seen the county records showing the sales that actually occurred." "But the county records are forgeries. Different paper stock, different notary stamps, signatures that do not match. Are you claiming you were unaware of this?" Clayton's jaw tightened on the video. "I am saying the county records are the official legal documents. Whatever Duke Anderson claimed to have is not relevant to legitimate business conducted through proper channels." Sarah had smiled at that response. "So if Duke Anderson's documents prove the county records are forgeries, you are saying you knowingly relied on forged documents to claim mineral rights?" Clayton's lawyer had objected, instructed his client not to answer, but the damage was done. The question was on record. The implication was clear. Clayton either knew about the fraud and participated, or was so willfully ignorant that he might as well have known. Jack watched the video and understood what Sarah was building. Not just a case about what happened in the 70s, but a case about Clayton's ongoing participation in covering up crimes. About how Sutton Energy had continued to benefit from theft and murder for 50 years, making everyone who ran the company potentially liable. The barn raising continued through the week. By Saturday, the structure was complete, roof on, siding installed, massive sliding doors hung on rails that actually worked. It was not the historic timber frame barn that had burned, but it was solid and functional, and it had been built by hands that understood what they were defending. The final day of construction felt like celebration, families bringing food for a potluck, kids running around the property, the valley alive with the sounds of community that had been missing since the ranching economy collapsed decades ago. Jack stood with Ethan watching the gathering, feeling something close to hope for the first time since Sarah died. This was what fighting for something bigger than yourself looked like. This was what happened when people decided that standing together mattered more than individual safety. But in the middle of the celebration, Sarah pulled Jack aside with news that changed the entire calculation of the fight. The retired geologist who had provided the 1995 survey data had continued reviewing his old files. He had found something that Sutton Energy had suppressed even more carefully than the reserve estimates. A secondary analysis done in 2010, using updated drilling technology and seismic imaging, that showed the Anderson Valley field was even larger than the 95 survey had indicated. The 2010 analysis estimated recoverable reserves at 70 million barrels, not 48 million, 70 million. The numbers were so large they stopped feeling real, became abstract symbols rather than actual wealth. But Sarah walked Jack through the implications with brutal clarity. 70 million barrels at current prices of $80 per barrel meant $5.6 billion in total field value. 75% mineral rights meant $4.2 billion belonging to the 31 families. Split evenly, that was $135 million per family. For some families with larger parcels, the number would be closer to 200 million. This was not compensation anymore. This was generational wealth. This was creating dynasties from families that had lived in poverty for 50 years, transforming them into some of the richest people in Wyoming. And it meant that Sutton Energy's total liability, accounting for unpaid royalties and penalties and legal fees, was probably north of $3 billion. The company was worth maybe $800 million based on public filings, which meant that if the families won, Sutton Energy would be completely destroyed. Not just damaged or diminished, but utterly bankrupt, forced to liquidate every asset to pay judgments they could never fully satisfy. Jack sat down slowly on a hay bale, processing numbers that felt like winning the lottery 31 times over. How do we even verify reserves that large? Independent drilling, but that costs millions and takes months, or we force Sutton to produce their internal assessments. They have done the drilling. They know exactly what is down there. Discovery lets us demand those documents. And if we get them, and they show 70 million barrels, then we have proof they have been committing securities fraud by underreporting reserves to investors, tax fraud by underpaying royalties to the state, and regulatory fraud by lying to federal oversight agencies. The criminal exposure goes beyond just Warren's generation. Clayton is potentially liable for fraud committed during his tenure as CEO. Jack thought about what this meant for the families, for the Hendersons and the Yateses and the Reeveses and the Morrisons, for people who had grown up thinking their grandparents had failed, learning instead that they were heirs to fortunes that had been stolen and hidden for half a century. We need to tell them. The families need to know what they are actually fighting for. Sarah had already arranged a meeting. That Sunday, representatives from 28 of the 31 families gathered in the new barn. 3 families had died out completely, no heirs remaining, but 28 families meant over 100 descendants of the original ranchers who had been defrauded. They sat on folding chairs and hay bales while Sarah presented the evidence and the numbers, watching their faces transform from skepticism to shock to something approaching disbelief. When she told them the per-family value could be over $100 million, the room went completely silent. These were not wealthy people. These were working families, teachers and construction workers and small business owners who lived paycheck to paycheck. For most of them, $100,000 would have been life-changing. Being told they might be entitled to $100 million was so far outside their experience that they could not process it as real. An older woman, granddaughter of William Henderson, the clerk who had helped Jack research the county records, stood up with tears streaming down her face. My grandfather died thinking he was a failure, died believing he had lost the ranch through bad choices. You are telling me he was robbed of $100 million and never knew it? Yes, ma'am, Sarah said gently. He was robbed, they were all robbed, and we are going to get it back. The meeting turned into something between a revival and a war council. Families sharing stories of grandparents who had died broke and bitter. Children realizing their poverty had not been inevitable but imposed. The collective rage in that barn was palpable, decades of accumulated loss transformed into fuel for the fight ahead. But Sarah also warned them about what came next. Sutton Energy would use every tactic available to delay and obstruct and intimidate. They would drag depositions out for months. They would file motions to dismiss and motions to delay and motions for sanctions. They would hire investigators to dig into every family's past looking for anything that could be used to discredit them. And they would run out the clock, hoping that families would get tired or scared or desperate for quick money and accept settlements that were fractions of what they actually deserved. They will offer you millions to drop the case, Sarah said. Maybe 10 million per family, maybe 20. Amounts that will sound like more money than you could ever spend. And they will make it sound easy. Just sign here, take the money, walk away. No more fighting, no more risk, just immediate wealth. She paused and looked around the room. But if you take those settlements, you will be accepting pennies on the dollar for what you are actually owed. You will be letting them buy their way out of murder and fraud. And you will be teaching your children that powerful people can commit any crime as long as they have enough money to pay off their victims. A middle-aged man, grandson of one of the murdered ranchers Frank Morrison had documented, stood up. My grandfather was killed for trying to fight these people, burned alive in a barn fire that was ruled accidental. I grew up thinking he died in a tragic accident. Now I find out he was murdered and the murderers got away with it for 50 years. I do not want their settlement money. I want them destroyed. I want every dollar they have taken from us. I want them in prison, and I want the world to know what they did. Applause filled the barn. One by one, the families stood and committed to seeing the fight through regardless of how long it took or what it cost. They elected representatives to coordinate with Sarah, agreed to split legal costs from a common fund, and voted to reject any settlement offer less than full restoration of rights plus damages. Jack watched the families uniting and understood what Duke Anderson had hoped would happen when someone finally found his vault. Not just individual families getting compensation, but a collective movement demanding justice. Not just legal victory, but moral reckoning. After the meeting, Sarah and Jack sat in the new barn while the families drove away into the evening. They are ready to fight, Sarah said, but fights like this need funding. Expert witnesses cost money. Geological surveys cost money. Depositions and court reporters and travel and all the mechanics of complex litigation, it adds up fast. We have some money from the defense fund, but not enough for a multi-year battle. Jack had been thinking about this exact problem, about the $4.2 million in cash and gold still secured in the vault beneath the barn, about how that money was legally his, found on property he owned, no obligation to share it with anyone, about how it could buy security for Ethan, could pay for education and health care, and all the things poverty had denied the Morrison family for 2 generations. But he also thought about Duke Anderson's letter, about how the money was meant to fund the fight, to pay for justice that the families could not afford on their own, about how taking that money for himself would be exactly the kind of selfishness that had let Warren Sutton get away with murder in the first place. I have the money, Jack said. Sarah looked at him. The vault money, $4.2 million. Duke left it to fund this fight. That is what we are going to use it for. Jack, that money is legally yours. You do not have to give it up. Yes, I do. Because this fight is bigger than me getting rich. This is about finishing what my grandfather and Duke Anderson started. They both died without seeing justice. I am not going to let that happen again because I was too selfish to use the resources I was given. He looked at Ethan, who had been listening quietly. What do you think, buddy? Should we use the vault money to help the families? Ethan, 8 years old and carrying wisdom beyond his years from watching his mother die and his father struggle, spoke with the clarity that children sometimes accessed. What would great-grandpa Frank want us to do? Jack felt his chest tighten. He would want us to help the families, to make sure the fight he died trying to win actually got won. Then we should help them. We will be okay. We always figure it out. Jack pulled his son close, feeling the weight of the choice, but also the rightness of it. The Morrison family had been poor for 2 generations because wealth was stolen from them. Using recovered wealth to help other families get their wealth back felt like the only choice that honored what Frank and Duke had sacrificed. $4.2 million goes into the legal fund, Jack said to Sarah. You use it to hire the best experts, the best investigators, whatever we need to make this case airtight. We are going to give those families everything they are owed, and we are going to make sure Sutton Energy does not have a dollar left when this is over. Sarah nodded, understanding the magnitude of what Jack was giving up. This makes you either very brave or very foolish. My grandfather was both. Guess it runs in the family. The legal war accelerated after that. With proper funding, Sarah hired a team of lawyers from a national firm that specialized in complex fraud cases. She brought in petroleum engineers to assess the field independently. She hired forensic accountants to trace every dollar Sutton Energy had made from the fraudulent mineral rights. The case transformed from a scrappy David versus Goliath fight into a professional prosecution, backed by resources that could actually compete with corporate legal teams. The depositions continued. Every member of Sutton Energy's executive team was questioned under oath. Every document related to the Anderson Valley operations was demanded and reviewed. The pattern of fraud became undeniable, documented in Sutton's own internal communications. Emails from 2005, where executives discussed how to suppress the geological survey data. Memos from 2012 about maintaining the fiction of smaller reserves. Meeting notes where legal strategies for blocking mineral rights challenges were planned. And through it all, Clayton Sutton's desperation became more visible. He appeared on local television pleading his case, claiming the families were trying to destroy a company that employed hundreds of people and supported the local economy. He took out full-page newspaper ads presenting Sutton Energy's version of history. He lobbied state legislators to pass laws that would limit liability for historical business practices. But the public was not buying it. The image of working families being robbed by a corporation was too powerful. The evidence of murder and fraud was too clear. And the fact that Clayton was spending millions on public relations instead of simply proving his innocence in court made him look guilty. Then came the call that changed everything. Sarah's phone rang at 9 p.m. on a Thursday night 3 months after the barn raising. Jack was at the ranch going through documents when she called him, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Clayton's lawyers just contacted me. They want to settle. For how much? Everything. Full restoration of mineral rights to all families. $300 million in cash damages. Agreement to cooperate with ongoing criminal investigations. Resignation of Clayton Sutton as CEO. Dissolution of Sutton Energy with assets liquidated to pay judgments. Jack tried to process what he was hearing. That is surrender. That is total surrender. It is bankruptcy. Their lawyers finally convinced Clayton that fighting was going to cost more than surrendering, that he was going to lose everything either way, but surrendering now might let him avoid prison time. You think he is serious? I think he is terrified. The FBI investigation is closing in. The state attorney general has convened a grand jury. If he fights and loses, he goes to prison for decades. If he settles and cooperates, he might walk away with his freedom and a few million hidden in offshore accounts. Jack felt the victory in his grasp, but also the hollowness of it. Clayton Sutton walking away with millions, while families had suffered for 50 years, did not feel like justice. It felt like the same system that had let Warren Sutton kill Duke Anderson, just playing out with different names. We should take it to the families, let them vote. The families gathered again in the new barn. Sarah presented the settlement offer with brutal honesty. $300 million in cash meant roughly $10 million per family after legal fees and costs. The mineral rights restoration meant they would start receiving royalty checks based on actual production, probably another $5 to $10 million per family over the next 20 years. Total package per family would be $15 to $20 million. Not the $100 million they were technically owed based on the full value of the reserves, but life-changing money nonetheless. Money that would transform every family from working class to wealthy in a single signature. The vote was not unanimous. Some families wanted to keep fighting, wanted to go to trial and make Clayton Sutton answer for his crimes in front of a jury. But the majority understood the reality of litigation, that trials could take years and appeals could take decades, and nothing was guaranteed. Taking $20 million now was better than fighting for $100 million they might never actually collect. The final vote was 23 families in favor of settlement, 5 opposed. Sarah would take the settlement terms back to Sutton's lawyers and begin finalizing the agreement. But that night, after the families left and Jack sat alone in the barn looking at the vault that had started everything, his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered and heard a voice he recognized but had not expected. Tom Yates, Clayton Sutton's head of security, the man who had threatened Jack during that first visit to the ranch. "Mr. Morrison, we have never spoken directly, but I need you to know something. Clayton is planning to run." Jack went cold. Run where? Mexico, then probably somewhere without extradition. The settlement offer is a stall tactic. He is liquidating assets quietly, moving money offshore. In 72 hours, he is supposed to sign the settlement agreement. Instead, he is getting on a private plane and disappearing. You will get nothing. The families will get nothing. And he will live out his life on stolen money in some country that does not care about American fraud charges. Why are you telling me this? Tom's voice was heavy with something that sounded like regret. Because I have spent 40 years doing dirty work for the Sutton family, have done things I am not proud of, but I am not going to help Clayton escape justice for murder. Duke Anderson was a good man. Watching Warren Sutton kill him and get away with it has haunted me for 50 years. I cannot stop Clayton from running, but I can make sure you know when and where so you can stop him. He gave Jack the details. Private airfield 50 miles outside Clearwater, Saturday at dawn. Small jet chartered under a shell company name. 2 pilots, 1 security guard, Clayton traveling alone. Then Tom Yates hung up. Jack sat holding his phone, processing the information, understanding that this was the moment where the entire fight could be won or lost. If Clayton escaped, the settlement was void. The families would be back to square one, fighting a bankrupt corporation with no one left to hold accountable. 50 years of injustice would continue, just with different victims. But if they could stop Clayton from fleeing, if they could ensure he faced justice in an American courtroom, then everything Duke and Frank had died trying to accomplish would finally happen. Jack called Sarah and the FBI, told them what Tom Yates had revealed. The FBI agents were skeptical at first, concerned it might be a trap, but when they ran the charter information, it checked out. A jet was registered to a shell company with links to Sutton Energy. Flight plan filed for Mexico City. Departure scheduled for Saturday dawn. The FBI could arrest Clayton at the airfield, but they needed probable cause beyond an anonymous tip. Sarah provided that cause by filing emergency motions, with the court requesting hold orders on Clayton's passport and restrictions on his travel. The motions cited the settlement negotiations and the risk of flight. A friendly judge signed the orders Friday afternoon. Saturday morning, Jack and Sarah drove to the private airfield with FBI agents following in unmarked cars. They parked where they could see the small terminal building and the jet sitting on the tarmac, engines already running. The sun was just starting to light the eastern sky when a black SUV pulled up to the terminal, and Clayton Sutton got out carrying a single bag. He looked older than he had 3 months ago, thinner, worn down by the weight of fighting a battle he was finally losing. He walked toward the jet with the resigned movements of a man who had run out of options and was taking the only escape route left. The FBI agents moved when Clayton reached the stairs to the jet. 4 agents surrounding him, badges out, voices calm but firm. Clayton Sutton, you are under arrest for violating court orders restricting your travel. Clayton did not run, did not fight, just stood there on the tarmac with his bag at his feet and his jet waiting and his freedom slipping away. When the agents cuffed him and read him his rights, he looked across the tarmac and saw Jack standing by the SUV. Their eyes met for a moment that felt frozen in time. Then Clayton smiled, thin and bitter. You win. Congratulations. You destroyed a company that employed 400 people and supported an entire county economy. Hope you feel good about that. I feel good about getting justice for 31 families your grandfather robbed and murdered. What you call destruction, I call accountability. They took Clayton away in handcuffs. The jet sat empty on the tarmac, engines winding down, going nowhere. And Jack Morrison stood watching the sunrise paint the mountains in colors that promised this day would be different from all the days before it. Today, justice was not delayed. Today, the powerful did not escape consequences. Today, a man who built his fortune on theft and murder faced the price of his crimes. The fight was not over. There would still be trials and sentencing, and the long work of actually distributing the settlement money to families. But the war had been won. Clayton Sutton was in custody. Sutton Energy was finished, and 31 families were about to receive the wealth that had been stolen from them 54 years ago. Jack drove back to Anderson Valley as the sun climbed higher, lighting the valley where Duke Anderson had built his vault, and where Frank Morrison had fought, and where Jack had found the evidence that changed everything. The new barn stood solid against the morning light, built by community hands, proof that burning down what people built just made them build it stronger. Ethan was waiting at the ranch, awake early with the nervous energy of a child who understood something important was happening. When Jack told him that Clayton had been arrested trying to flee, that the families would get their money, that justice was finally arriving after 50 years, Ethan asked the question that mattered most. Would great-grandpa Frank be proud? Jack thought about his grandfather dying at 61 thinking he had failed, about Duke Anderson murdered for trying to expose the truth, about Roy Tucker living 50 years with the weight of cowardice, about all the families that had suffered while believing their poverty was their own fault. Yeah, buddy, Frank would be proud, Duke would be proud, your mom would be proud, and I am proud of you for being brave enough to stay in this fight even when it got scary. They walked to the vault entrance, now secured and empty but still holding the weight of the history it had protected. Jack thought about Duke building this place, brick by brick, knowing he might not live to see its purpose fulfilled. About the faith it took to trust that someone would find it, would understand what it meant, would have the courage to use it properly. That faith had been rewarded. The vault's secrets had toppled an empire. And now, On a Saturday morning in Wyoming with the valley waking up to a day that would change 31 families forever, Jack Morrison understood that he had been exactly the right person to find Duke's evidence. Not because he was special or chosen, but because he had been desperate enough to gamble everything on a condemned ranch and stubborn enough to fight when powerful men told him to walk away. Sometimes desperate gambles paid off. Sometimes the impossible happened. Sometimes justice delayed for half a century finally arrived. And sometimes, in a barn built on foundations laid by murdered ranchers, the truth won not because it was powerful but because ordinary people refused to let it stay buried. The sun climbed higher, the valley breathed, and Jack Morrison stood with his son on land that carried his name on a deed, knowing that the Morrison family story had finally turned a corner, from poverty to purpose, from failure to redemption, from victims to victors who had earned their victory through stubborn refusal to quit when quitting would have been easier. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but today they had one, and that was enough. The trial of Clayton Sutton began on a cold Monday in February, 6 months after his arrest at the private airfield. The federal courthouse in Cheyenne was packed beyond capacity. Families who had driven hours to watch justice finally arrive. Reporters from networks across the country covering a story that had become more than local news and transformed into something larger about accountability and the price of generational greed. Jack sat in the gallery with Ethan on one side and Sarah on the other, watching Clayton enter in an orange jumpsuit and ankle chains, his expensive suits replaced by prison clothing, his confident swagger replaced by the careful movements of a man who understood his life was effectively over regardless of the verdict. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, securities fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy to obstruct justice, witness tampering. And underlying everything, the knowledge that his grandfather had built Sutton Energy on murder and theft, crimes that Clayton had continued profiting from for 40 years. The prosecution presented the case methodically over 3 weeks. Duke Anderson's tape recordings played for the jury, that voice from 54 years ago describing threats made over drinks, warnings about accidents that happened to stubborn old men. Roy Tucker testified from a wheelchair oxygen tank beside him, his voice weak but his memory sharp, describing in detail how he had watched Warren Sutton order Duke Anderson's murder and then stage the scene to look like a tractor accident. The vault documents were entered into evidence, page after page of proof showing the systematic fraud. Original mineral rights agreements where families retained 75% of subsurface rights, compared side by side with forged county records showing sales for pennies. The jury could see the differences themselves: different paper, different notary stamps, signatures that were close but not quite right, the kind of forgeries that passed casual inspection but fell apart under scrutiny. Frank Morrison's tape was played next, Jack's grandfather speaking from beyond the grave about watching friends murdered and knowing he would be next, documenting the pattern of deaths that turned fraud into genocide against a way of life. The jury listened in absolute silence, and when the tape ended, several jurors were wiping their eyes. The geological surveys came next, the public filings showing 4 million barrels of reserves, numbers Sutton Energy had reported to investors and regulators for 30 years. Then the suppressed surveys showing first 48 million barrels in 1995, then 70 million in 2010. Expert witnesses explained how Sutton Energy had systematically underreported reserves to avoid higher royalty payments, how they had lied to shareholders about the value of their holdings, how the entire company had been built on hiding the truth about what they actually owned. Clayton's defense attorneys tried to argue that he had inherited a company structure he did not create, that he was guilty of negligence perhaps but not criminal intent. But the prosecution presented emails from Clayton's own accounts discussing the need to maintain the fiction of smaller reserves. internal memos about legal strategies for blocking mineral rights challenges, meeting notes where Clayton personally approved payments to silence potential whistleblowers. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable. Clayton Sutton had not just inherited his grandfather's crimes. He had actively participated in covering them up and continuing the fraud for his entire tenure as CEO. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was guilty on all counts. Clayton showed no emotion as the judge read the decision, just stared straight ahead like a man who had already left his body and was watching events from somewhere distant and disconnected. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The federal guidelines called for 15 to 20 years, but the judge went higher, citing the scope of the fraud and the lives destroyed across generations. 25 years in federal prison. Clayton Sutton was 58 years old. He would be 83 if he served the full sentence, would spend what remained of his life in a cell, would die without the wealth and power that had defined his existence. Jack felt no joy in the sentencing, just a kind of grim satisfaction that accountability had finally arrived. This was not about revenge. This was about proving that the rule of law applied even to powerful men who thought themselves above it. This was about showing 31 families that their grandparents had not failed, had been victims of crimes that were finally being punished. After the sentencing, Jack and Ethan visited Roy Tucker in the hospice center where he had been moved when it became clear his body was giving up the fight his conscience had started. The lung cancer had spread, aggressive and unstoppable, eating through organs that 81 years of life had already worn thin. Roy was on morphine now, drifting between sleep and waking, between present and past, between the man he had been and the man he had tried to become in his final year. When Roy's eyes focused on Jack, something like peace crossed his weathered face. Did they convict him? Roy's voice was barely audible, words formed with effort. 25 years. He is going to die in prison. Roy nodded slowly. Good, Duke can rest now. They all can. You gave them that rest. Your testimony put Clayton away. 54 years too late. All those families that suffered while I stayed quiet. Jack leaned closer. You told the truth when it mattered. That is what counts. Duke would forgive you, Frank would forgive you, and the families already have. Roy's eyes closed. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lighter somehow, like he was already halfway to wherever the dead went. I am ready, carried this weight so long, ready to put it down. He died 3 hours later with Jack and Ethan sitting beside him, the old man's breathing gradually slowing and then simply stopping, the long burden of cowardice finally released in a last exhale that seemed to carry more than just breath. Jack sat with the body for a while after the nurses had been called, thinking about redemption and courage and the price of silence. Roy Tucker had been a coward for 54 years and a hero for 1. But that 1 year had mattered more than all the years before it, had made the difference between Duke Anderson's murder staying buried and justice finally being served. They buried Roy next to Duke Anderson in the small cemetery outside Clearwater, the same ground where Frank Morrison was buried 3 plots over. The funeral drew 200 people. Families who owed their restored wealth to Roy's testimony, old ranchers who remembered the men who had been killed, and the silence that had followed. Jack gave a short eulogy, spoke about how Roy had carried a secret that poisoned his life, but had finally found the courage to speak truth that set others free. As dirt fell on the casket, Jack thought about the 3 men buried in this cemetery who had tried to fight Warren Sutton and paid different prices for their resistance. Duke murdered, Frank destroyed, Roy silenced by fear, but in the end their combined efforts had won. Duke's evidence, Frank's documentation, Roy's testimony. Together they had brought down an empire. The settlement distribution happened in April, a ceremony held in the new barn on the Anderson Valley Ranch. because Sarah thought it appropriate that families receive their wealth in the place where the fight had started. Federal court officials brought certified checks in amounts that still seemed unreal even after months of preparation. $10 million per family in immediate cash settlement. Title transfers restoring 75% mineral rights to the original properties. Agreements with the new operating company that would take over Sutton Energy's assets, guaranteeing royalty payments based on actual production rather than fraudulent underreporting. Jack watched families open envelopes containing checks with numbers followed by 6 zeros, watched their faces transform from skepticism to shock to tears. These were not wealthy people. These were teachers and construction workers and small business owners who had lived paycheck to paycheck their entire lives. $10 million was not just money. It was freedom from worry. It was college educations for grandchildren. It was retirement without fear. It was proof that their parents and grandparents had not been failures, but victims of theft that was finally being made right. The Henderson family, descendants of the county clerk who had helped Jack research the original fraud, stood together looking at their check with expressions mixing joy and grief. Their patriarch spoke for many when he said the money was wonderful, but what mattered more was knowing his grandfather had been robbed rather than foolish. That vindication of memory meant more than wealth. When it came time for the Morrison family distribution, Sarah called Jack forward. He had expected this moment but still felt strange accepting money for something that had never been about getting rich. The check was for $12 million, larger than most families because Frank Morrison's original ranch had been bigger than average. $12 million for the grandson of a man who died thinking he had lost everything to his own failures. Jack took the check and looked at it for a long moment, feeling the weight of numbers that could change his life and Ethan's life forever. Then he looked at his son, 8 years old, and watching with the careful attention of a child who understood that what adults did with money said something about who they were. "What do you think we should do with this?" Jack asked. Ethan thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. Great-grandpa Frank would want us to be okay, to have enough, but he would also want us to help other people. Jack nodded and turned to Sarah. "I want to keep $2 million. That is enough to pay off Sarah's legal fees, buy this property outright, make sure Ethan has education money, and we have security. The other $10 million goes into a foundation, the Frank Morrison Memorial Fund. We use it to help families facing medical bankruptcy or foreclosure or the kind of poverty that comes from systems designed to grind people down." Sarah was not surprised. She had known Jack long enough to understand he was not the kind of man who needed wealth to feel whole. But she still asked the question that needed asking. "You are giving away $10 million. You understand that, right? That is generational wealth you will never get back." "My grandfather lost generational wealth and never got it back either. But this time, the loss is a choice. We are choosing to honor Frank's legacy by helping people the way Duke and Frank tried to help people. That matters more than being rich." The families applauded, some because they agreed with the choice, others because they recognized in Jack's decision an echo of why they had fought in the first place. This had never been only about money. It had been about proving that doing right mattered even when doing right was expensive. With the settlement distributed and the criminal case concluded, Jack turned his attention to what would become of the Anderson Valley Ranch and the vault that had started everything. The property was his, bought legally and paid for with his last $850 plus $4,000 in back taxes he had paid over the past year. He could develop it or sell it or simply live there quietly. But none of those options felt right for land that held so much history. Sarah helped him establish the Anderson Valley Heritage Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to preserving the history of the mineral rights fraud and educating future generations about corporate crime and the importance of documentation and truth. The ranch became the foundation's headquarters. The new barn was converted to a museum and education center, with exhibits showing the vault documents and telling the stories of the families who had been robbed and the men who had died trying to expose the fraud. The vault itself was preserved exactly as Jack had found it, visitors able to descend the concrete stairs and see the space where Duke Anderson had hidden evidence for 54 years. The filing cabinet still stood against the walls, now holding copies of the original documents since the real ones were in federal archives. Duke's handwritten note was displayed in a climate-controlled case, his words preserved for anyone who needed to understand why one man might choose to die protecting truth. The foundation hired local teachers to develop curriculum about the case, created programs where high school students could research their own family histories and learn about systems of power and resistance. The story of Duke Anderson and Frank Morrison and the 31 families became required learning in Wyoming schools, a case study in both corporate crime and civic courage. On the first anniversary of buying the ranch, Jack and Ethan stood at the vault entrance looking at a plaque that had been installed on the wall. It listed the names of everyone who had fought the fraud. Duke Anderson, murdered 1972. Frank Morrison, destroyed 1978. Robert Reeves, driven to suicide 1986. Roy Tucker, who found courage after 5 decades of fear. And 31 families who had waited 50 years for justice and finally received it. Below the names was a quote from Duke Anderson's letter. "Use it wisely or sell it carefully, but know that every dollar came from those who worked these fields when ranching was king. Do not dishonor that labor by being careless with what it produced." Ethan read the quote slowly. "We honored it, right, Dad? We used the vault money the way Duke wanted." "Yeah, buddy, we did exactly what Duke hoped someone would do." They walked back to the small house Jack had built on the property, modest and efficient, and nothing like the mansion $12 million could have bought. Jack had learned through poverty and the army and watching his wife die that happiness did not come from things you owned but from purpose you served. The house was comfortable enough. The land was theirs. The foundation gave their lives meaning beyond survival. That was wealth that mattered. The years passed in the rhythm of rural life, seasons turning, the valley changing through winter snow and summer heat, and the endless cycle of growth and dormancy. Ethan grew from 8 to 10 to 12, helping with the foundation's programs, giving tour of the vault to school groups, learning the story of his great-grandfather so thoroughly that Frank Morrison became real to him in ways that went beyond old photographs and family legends. The foundation thrived. Donations came from the families who had received settlements, from people who read about the case and wanted to support the work of preserving its lessons. The programs expanded beyond just the mineral rights fraud to include broader education about corporate accountability and whistleblower protection, and the role of documentation in fighting powerful interests. Jack continued doing construction work, not because he needed the money, but because he liked building things with his hands, and because staying connected to working people kept him grounded in the realities the foundation existed to address. He never remarried, though Sarah became a constant presence in his life and Ethan's, the three of them forming a family built not on legal ties but on shared purpose and respect. On the 5th anniversary of buying the ranch, the foundation hosted a reunion of all the families whose mineral rights had been restored. Over 300 people came, descendants of the original ranchers, spreading across the property in celebration that felt like homecoming. They shared stories about what the settlement money had meant, college educations that would have been impossible, medical treatments they could finally afford, retirements that came with dignity instead of fear. Small businesses started, homes bought, futures secured. But what they talked about most was not the money. It was the vindication, knowing their grandparents had not failed, knowing the poverty they had grown up with was not inevitable but imposed, knowing that fighting back against injustice was possible even when the odds seemed impossible. An elderly woman, granddaughter of one of the ranchers Frank Morrison, had documented as murdered, pulled Jack aside during the celebration. My grandmother used to cry about how my grandfather had failed her, how he had made bad choices that cost them everything. She died thinking that. But now we know the truth. He was killed for being brave, for standing up. I just wish she had lived long enough to know he was a hero, not a failure. Jack understood that grief perfectly. His own father had died thinking Frank Morrison's bankruptcy was shameful family history, had never known his father was a victim of conspiracy and murder. Some vindications came too late for the people who needed them most, but they still mattered for the generations that followed. Clayton Sutton served 3 years of his 25-year sentence before dying of a heart attack in federal prison. The news reached Jack on an autumn afternoon while he was teaching Ethan how to repair fence posts on the property line. The headline on his phone was simple: Sutton Energy heir dies in prison at 61. Jack read the article, felt nothing beyond mild acknowledgement that the story had reached its natural end, then put his phone away and went back to teaching his son the proper way to set a post so it would last for decades. That evening, a reporter called asking for comment on Clayton's death, whether Jack felt vindicated or whether he regretted the role he had played in Clayton's downfall. Jack thought about the question carefully before answering. Clayton Sutton spent 3 years in prison for crimes that destroyed 31 families over 50 years. That is not justice balanced. That is barely justice started. But it was more accountability than his grandfather ever faced, more than most powerful men who commit fraud ever see. I do not celebrate his death. I am just glad that before he died, he had to face consequences for what his family did. The reporter asked if Jack would attend Clayton's funeral. Jack said no. That chapter was closed. The fight was won. And spending energy on Clayton Sutton's death when he could spend it building programs that prevented future Clayton Suttons felt like better use of time. By the time Ethan turned 14, the foundation had become a recognized leader in corporate accountability education, partnering with universities and law schools and advocacy organizations across the country. The Anderson Valley case was taught in business ethics courses and legal history seminars and journalism programs studying the role of documentation in exposing wrongdoing. Duke Anderson's vault had become more than local history. It had become a symbol of why truth preservation mattered. But for Jack, the most important legacy was watching Ethan grow into a young man who understood that character was built through choices about what to do when no one was forcing you to do right. Ethan had watched his father give away $10 million to help strangers, had watched him choose purpose over comfort, had learned through example that wealth meant nothing if it was not used for something beyond yourself. On Ethan's 14th birthday, Jack took him to visit the graves of Duke Anderson, Frank Morrison, and Roy Tucker, the 3 men whose combined resistance had made everything possible. They stood in the cemetery while Jack told stories about each man. Duke's courage in collecting evidence knowing it might get him killed. Frank's stubborn insistence on fighting even when the odds were hopeless. Roy's redemption after 54 years of cowardice. These men were not perfect, Jack said. Duke was stubborn and difficult. Frank could be harsh and demanding. Roy was a coward for most of his life. But when it mattered, when the moment came to choose between staying safe and doing right, they made the hard choice. He looked at his son. That is what I want you to remember. Not that we got rich or famous or that we beat powerful people. I want you to remember that we had evidence of terrible crimes and we could have stayed quiet or sold out or looked the other way. But we chose to fight, and that choice mattered more than anything money could buy. Ethan stood quiet for a moment, then spoke with the wisdom that sometimes arrived when children stopped being children and started becoming adults. Great-grandpa Frank would be proud of what we built here, not just the foundation or the money, but that we chose to help people the way he tried to help people. Yeah, I think he would be. They drove back to the ranch as the sun set behind the western mountains, the valley filled with that particular quality of light that made everything look both sharper and softer at the same time. The barn stood solid against the sky, built by community hands after fire had destroyed the original. The house showed lights in the windows, Sarah visiting for dinner like she did most evenings, the three of them having fallen into patterns of family without ever formally acknowledging what they had become. That night over dinner, Sarah shared news about a case she was working on in Montana, another instance of corporate fraud against ranching families, another pattern of theft disguised as legitimate business. She wanted to know if the foundation could help, could provide documentation training and research support, and maybe funding for families who could not afford to fight well-financed corporate defense teams. Jack agreed immediately. This was exactly what the foundation existed for. Duke Anderson's evidence had saved 31 families, but the lessons from that fight could save others if they were shared and applied. The vault's legacy was not just about one victory in one valley. It was about proving that documentation and courage and community could beat systems designed to protect the powerful. The Montana case took 2 years to resolve, but with the foundation's help the families won, mineral rights restored, fraud exposed, another corporate empire built on theft dismantled and distributed to its victims. The patterns were different, but the fundamentals were the same. Powerful interests stealing from working families, covering up crimes through corrupted systems, counting on victims being too poor or scared or worn down to fight back. But the foundation had created a model for fighting back. Document everything, find allies, go public, use media attention to create pressure, build coalitions, stay stubborn, and most importantly, understand that the fight was worth having even when winning seemed impossible. By the time Ethan graduated high school, the foundation had supported 12 similar cases across 7 states, winning 9, settling 2, losing 1 but establishing precedent that made future cases easier. Hundreds of families had received restored rights and compensation. Dozens of corporate executives had faced criminal charges. The Anderson Valley model had become a blueprint for resistance. Ethan chose to attend college in Wyoming, studying history and journalism, planning to come back to the foundation and continue the work after graduation. Jack tried not to be too obviously proud, but watching his son choose purpose over easier paths felt like proof that the lessons of the past decade had taken root in ways that mattered. On the 10th anniversary of buying the Anderson Valley Ranch, the foundation held a ceremony dedicating a memorial garden on the property. Bronze plaques told the story of Duke Anderson's murder, Frank Morrison's destruction, the 31 families who waited 50 years for justice. Educational displays explained how the fraud had worked, how it had been covered up, how ordinary people had finally exposed it. The governor attended. State representatives gave speeches about accountability and justice. The families came, now numbering over 500 when you counted all the children and grandchildren whose lives had been changed by restored wealth. News cameras recorded it for posterity, another chapter in a story that had gone from local tragedy to national example of what persistence and courage could accomplish. Jack stood at the back of the crowd during the speeches, uncomfortable with attention, preferring to watch rather than be watched. But when the ceremony ended and people started approaching him with thanks and stories and requests for photographs. He accepted it with grace because he understood that he represented something larger than himself. He was the face of a fight that dozens of people had contributed to, that Duke and Frank and Roy had started, that Sarah had prosecuted, that communities had supported. An old rancher, one of the original 31 who had been young when his grandfather lost everything to Sutton fraud, shook Jack's hand with tears in his eyes. "You gave me back my family's honor, gave my kids something to be proud of instead of ashamed of. That is worth more than all the money we got." Jack thought about his own grandfather, about Frank Morrison dying thinking he had failed, about how that shame had poisoned the Morrison family for 2 generations, about how knowing the truth, even 50 years late, had transformed that shame into pride. "Your grandfather was a good man who got cheated," Jack said. "Make sure your grandchildren know that. Make sure the story gets told right." As the sun set on the 10th anniversary celebration, Jack and Ethan and Sarah walked through the memorial garden, reading the names of everyone who had been affected by the fraud. 31 families, 5 murdered ranchers, hundreds of descendants who had grown up in poverty that was not their fault, all of them now part of a story that proved justice could arrive even after decades of delay. They stopped at Duke Anderson's plaque. The bronze showed a relief of the vault door, the stone stairs descending into darkness, the filing cabinets holding secrets that had waited 54 years. Below the image, Duke's words from his letter. "To whoever finds this vault, the gold belongs to those who suffered. The documents prove crimes the government chose to bury. Use both wisely, or history's victims will remain silenced." "We used it wisely, right?" Ethan asked. The same question he had asked years before, but with new understanding of what wisdom meant. Jack looked at the foundation building, at the museum preserving history, at the families gathered in celebration, at the memorial ensuring no one would forget. "Yeah, we honored Duke's trust. We finished what he and Frank started, and we built something that will keep fighting long after we are gone." They walked back toward the house as stars began appearing in the darkening sky, the same stars that had watched Duke build his vault and Frank document murders, and Jack buy a condemned ranch for $850. The same stars that would watch whatever came next, whatever battles future generations would need to fight against powerful interests that thought themselves untouchable. But tonight, under those eternal stars, Jack Morrison allowed himself to feel something he had not felt since Sarah died. He felt at peace. The fight that had consumed 10 years was complete. The enemies were defeated. The families were restored. His grandfather's name was vindicated, and the Morrison family legacy had transformed from poverty and shame to purpose and dignity. The ranch stood solid against the night, built on foundations Duke Anderson had laid, and Jack Morrison had found, and communities had reinforced with their labor and loyalty. The vault waited below, empty of treasure but full of meaning, a testament to why documentation mattered, and why truth was worth protecting even at the cost of everything. Jack stood at the door of the house looking back at the valley, at the land that had given him shelter when he had nowhere else to go, that had held secrets he was meant to find, that had become the foundation for building a life that mattered beyond survival. Ethan came and stood beside him, 14 years old and already showing the man he would become, shaped by watching his father choose courage over comfort and purpose over wealth. "You think we will ever sell this place?" Ethan asked. "No, this is Morrison land now, has our name on a deed. We are going to hold it and pass it down and make sure your kids and their kids know the story of what happened here. The story of how you bought a barn for $850 and found a fortune. The story of how Duke Anderson and Frank Morrison fought for justice and paid with their lives, and how 50 years later we finished their fight. That is the story that matters. The money was just tools. The real fortune was the chance to make things right. They went inside where Sarah had dinner waiting, the three of them sitting down to a meal in a house built with purpose instead of wealth, on land that carried meaning beyond property value, in a valley that had learned that justice delayed was painful, but justice denied was unbearable. Somewhere in the darkness, the vault kept watch over history, holding space for ghosts who could finally rest knowing their deaths had not been for nothing. Their evidence had mattered. Their trust in future generations had been rewarded. Duke Anderson had died protecting truth. Frank Morrison had died fighting for it. Roy Tucker had redeemed 50 years of cowardice by speaking it. And Jack Morrison had proven that sometimes desperate men gambling on condemned ranches found exactly what they needed to become who they were meant to be. Not rich, not famous, but purposeful, useful, part of something that mattered more than any individual life. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had witnessed empires rise and fall, that had watched crimes committed and eventually answered for, that would continue watching long after everyone involved in the Anderson Valley case was dust and memory. But the story would remain. The lessons would endure. The proof that ordinary people could beat extraordinary evil would inspire future fights. Jack Morrison slept that night without nightmares for the first time in 10 years, without poverty anxiety or fear for his son's future, or the weight of fighting battles that seemed too large to win. He slept knowing that he had done what his grandfather could not do, had finished what Duke Anderson started, had used $850 to change the lives of 31 families, and prove that the Morrison name meant something beyond failure. The morning would bring new challenges. There would always be more fights, more families needing help, more corporate crimes to expose. But tonight, in a house built on land bought with the last money he had, Jack Morrison rested in the knowledge that desperate gambles sometimes paid off beyond anything you dared hope for. The Anderson Valley Vault had kept its secrets for 54 years. Jack Morrison had found them and used them exactly as Duke Anderson had trusted someone would. And in doing so, he had transformed his life from running from eviction into building something that would outlast him and matter long after his name was forgotten. That was legacy. That was purpose. That was what it meant to take $850 and condemned property and evidence of 50-year-old crimes and turn them into justice that changed the world for hundreds of families, not through genius or luck or special advantages, but through stubborn refusal to quit when quitting was easier, through choosing to stand when others said to walk away, through understanding that some fights were worth everything you had because winning them meant proving that right could still defeat power when ordinary people found extraordinary courage. The valley slept, the vault waited, and Jack Morrison, grandson of a man who died thinking he had failed, rested knowing he had proven that Morrison men finished what they started, honored what they promised, and built legacies that mattered more than wealth. Tomorrow would tell new stories, but tonight the old stories finally had endings that honored everyone who had fought and died and sacrificed. Tonight, justice was not just delayed, it had fully arrived, and that was enough.